The night Zenith spent her last $11 on a stranger's meal, she had no idea she was buying herself a collision with the one man on earth most determined never to see her as human, or the one woman who would make that impossible to maintain. The oncology floor of Mercy General Hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet courage. Zenith Collins had worked on that floor for 3 years, and she still hadn't gotten used to it, the particular silence of people who were fighting for their lives without making a fuss about it. She respected that silence. She moved through it carefully, the way you move through a library or a church, aware that something sacred was happening all around you. It was 9:47 p.m. when she finally clocked out. 12 hours. 4 IV changes. 2 patients who'd cried and needed a hand to hold. One who'd passed at 6:15 quietly, with his daughter asleep in the chair beside him, and Zenith had been the one to gently wake the daughter, and she'd carried the weight of that woman's face all evening like something fragile in her chest. She pulled on her caramel brown puffer jacket in the break room, the one with the small tear near the left pocket she kept meaning to sew shut, and caught her reflection in the dark window above the sink. Braids half escaped from their bun, edges slightly frizzy, eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who pours from themselves all day and refills in secret. She looked tired. She looked like herself. She shouldered her bag and walked out into the November night. Chicago in November didn't bother with drama. No blizzards, no cinematic ice storms. Just a gray, bone-settling cold that arrived like an unwelcome truth. Quiet, persistent, impossible to argue with. Zenith walked fast, the way women who've grown up in neighborhoods like hers learn to walk. Head up. Eyes moving. Pace is deliberate and purposeful, because purposeful women get left alone. She had $11.43 in her checking account. Payday was tomorrow. She'd already done the math 17 times on the back of a receipt during her break. $11.43 tonight, $987 direct deposit tomorrow morning, and $750 rent due Friday, which left $237 for 2 weeks of groceries, transit, and the copay for the prescription she'd been stretching because she couldn't afford to refill it on schedule. It was fine. She'd worked with less. Tonight, she'd promised herself a $2.50 hot cocoa from Chang's on Mallard Street. Small mercies. That was the Zenith Collins philosophy of survival. Stop waiting for the ocean and learn to treasure every cup of water. She was half a block from Chang's when she saw her. The woman was sitting at the bus stop on the corner of Mallard and Fifth, like something that had been set down carefully and then forgotten. Korean, silver-haired, somewhere in her late 60s, with a bone structure that suggested she had once been, and perhaps still was, extraordinarily beautiful. She wore a silk blouse the color of pale jade and black slacks with a crease so sharp it looked intentional even now. Her shoes, low-heeled, Italian leather, and unmistakably expensive, were caked with mud on the soles. No coat. No purse. No phone. Her hands were folded in her lap with the precise composure of a woman who had been raised never to appear undone in public. But her lips were faintly, undeniably blue. Zenith's feet slowed before her brain gave the instruction. "Keep walking," said the voice she'd developed over years of having nothing to spare. "You have $11. You have rent on Friday. You have nothing extra. Keep walking." The woman's hands, folded so carefully, so determinately still, were trembling. Zenith stopped. "Excuse me." She stepped closer, slowly, the way you approach someone who might be frightened. "Ma'am? Are you okay?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were dark and sharp and assessing, even now. There was a flash of something guarded and proud in them before it softened, almost against her will, into something more fragile. "I am." She paused. Searched. Lost. Lost like, "Do you know what part of the city you're in?" A beat of dignified silence. "No. Do you have a phone? Someone you can call?" "I had one." She glanced at her hands. It is gone. I think someone, she stopped. Pressed her lips together. The sentence was beneath her to finish. Pickpocket. A single, stiff nod. Zenith looked at her again. The silk blouse. The Italian shoes. The posture that had never, in all likelihood, belonged on a bus stop bench. This woman was deeply, obviously lost, not just geographically. Are you hungry? The question came out before Zenith vetted it. Something moved across the old woman's face. It moved like weather, a front of pride, then a brief, clear window of something raw and human. Then, so quietly Zenith almost missed it. Yes. Right here, before this story goes any further, I need to ask you something. If you were Zenith tonight, 12-hour shift behind you, $11 to your name, rent due in 3 days, would you have stopped? Or would you have kept walking? Drop your answer in the comments, and let me which city or country you're watching from. Because I think your answer says more about you than you might expect. Chang's Noodle House was everything a good cheap restaurant should be. Small, overheated, fluorescent lit, and completely unpretentious. Mr. and Mrs. Chong had run it for 19 years and had a policy, unspoken but understood by regulars, of never rushing anyone. The soup was $6 a bowl. It arrived in a ceramic bowl the size of a small planet, full of hand-cut noodles and a broth that tasted like someone's grandmother had been tending it for days. Zenith ordered 2 bowls. She stood at the counter for 3 full seconds before ordering, doing the math one more time. $6 times 2 was $12, which was 57 cents more than she had, but she could put it on her transit card and transfer. She ordered 2 bowls and didn't let herself recalculate again. They settled into a red vinyl booth near the window. The old woman wrapped both hands around her bowl the moment it arrived. Not delicately, not with performance. Just wrapped her hands around the warmth like it was the first warm thing she'd touched in hours. Maybe it was. I'm Zenith, Zenith offered, pulling the paper off her chopsticks. The old woman looked at her. That same sharp, measuring look. Like she was reading something in a language she was deciding whether to trust. Then, Choi Jung-suk. She said it the way people say a name that carries enormous weight in other rooms. A name that commands things, that opens doors, that makes people straighten their spines. Here, in a fluorescent noodle shop on Mallard Street, it landed simply, like any other name. That's beautiful, Zenith said. Can I call you Mrs. Choi? Something shifted in the old woman's face. Not a smile exactly. More like the shadow a smile leaves behind when it's passing through. You may. They ate in a silence that, strangely, didn't need to be filled. Zenith watched Mrs. Choi eat, slowly, precisely, with manners so deeply ingrained they functioned even in distress, and felt an odd, unplaceable recognition. Like encountering a song you've never heard but somehow already know the melody to. Do you live nearby? Zenith asked after a while. No. Mrs. Choi set her spoon down briefly. I was visiting my son's office. The building on Western Avenue, the tall one, blue glass. She said my son's office with a particular careful neutrality, the way people refer to something very large by describing only its edges. I stepped out for air. I became turned around. And then my phone. A precise, tight pause. I could not find my way back. Western and what cross street? I do not know. The building is very tall. The lobby has a black marble floor. Zenith nodded. I know the one. Choi Tower. She said it without connecting the name, the way you say landmarks without thinking about who built them. That's about 6 blocks from here. I'll walk you back after we eat. Mrs. Choi looked at her across the table. Really looked, not the assessing look from before, but something slower, more deliberate. Why? She asked. Not unkindly. Genuinely. Zenith thought about it honestly. Because you were cold and hungry and lost, she said. And I could do something about that. So, my son, Mrs. Choi said slowly, would say that is a very foolish way to move through the world. Maybe, Zenith said, wrapping both hands around her bowl. But it's the only way I know how. Mrs. Choi was quiet for a long moment. She picked up her spoon again. And just before she brought it to her lips, so softly that Zenith almost missed it, she said, "Perhaps he is the foolish one." 4 blocks away, on the 38th floor of Choi Tower, a man was very, very still. Choi Hyun-woo stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his private office with his phone pressed to his ear and his jaw set in a way that made his assistant, hovering near the door, take one careful step backward. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had cost $4,000 and a watch that had cost considerably more, and neither of these things meant anything to him at this particular moment. "She left the building at 7:20 p.m., his head of security was saying. "We didn't realize she hadn't returned until now." Hyun-woo's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. Quiet was more frightening than loud, and he had learned that early. "She has no phone. She has no coat. It is 41 degrees outside." He paused. "And you are telling me this now?" "Sir, we thought she had gone back to the hotel." "Find her." He said it the way he said everything important, once, without decoration. "Find her in the next 30 minutes or I will find new security personnel in the next 31. He ended the call. He stood at the window and looked out at the city, at the grid of lights below him, amber and white and cold blue, sprawling in every direction, and allowed himself for exactly 4 seconds to feel something. His mother was out there. Alone. In a city she didn't know well, in a neighborhood she would never normally enter, without a phone or a coat, because she had insisted on coming to visit him today and he had been too busy, too important, too surrounded by things that mattered less, to leave his meeting and have dinner with her. He pressed 2 fingers briefly to his closed eyes. Then he straightened his cuffs, picked up his phone, and walked toward the elevator with the long, controlled stride of a man who had decided that feeling things was a luxury he could defer. He had done it his entire life. He was very good at it. He had no idea it was about to stop working. Outside, Zenith was paying for 2 bowls of soup with money she didn't quite have. She walked Mrs. Choi toward Western Avenue with one hand hovering near the old woman's elbow, not holding it, just nearby, just in case. And Mrs. Choi walked with her spine straight and her chin level, because she was Choi Jung-suk and she did not slouch, not even after being lost and cold and hungry in a strange neighborhood on a November night. Zenith found herself smiling at that. They were half a block from Choi Tower when the black SUV appeared. The SUV stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way powerful things stop when they found what they were looking for. Suddenly. Certain. Final. The back door opened before the driver had fully cut the engine, and Choi Hyun-woo stepped out onto the pavement of Mallard Street like a man who had never once in his life needed to check whether the ground was safe before putting his weight on it. He was tall, taller than Zenith had expected, though she hadn't been expecting anyone. Broad-shouldered in the way that good tailoring tries to suggest and actual physicality confirms. The charcoal suit. The watch catching the amber of the streetlight. A face that was, she registered this involuntarily, the way you register temperature or sound. Severely, inconveniently handsome. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes that moved with the quick, comprehensive efficiency of someone who assessed everything in the first 3 seconds and spent the rest of the time acting on those assessments. Those eyes went immediately to his mother. They moved over her silk blouse, her muddy shoes, her composed but slightly diminished posture, and something passed through his face. Fast. Gone before it fully arrived. But Zenith caught it, the way you catch something falling before your brain consciously decides to reach. Relief. Raw, unguarded, for exactly 1 second. Then it was sealed over and he was moving. Yama. He reached his mother in 4 strides, his hands going to her arms, his eyes moving over her face with a clinical urgency that was trying very hard not to be tenderness. He said something else in Korean, low, rapid, the cadence of questions. Are you hurt? Are you cold? What happened? Mrs. Choi answered in Korean, and whatever she said made his jaw tighten. He glanced back at the SUV. The driver was already out with a coat, a proper wool coat, moving toward them, and helped drape it around his mother's shoulders with a controlled, precise efficiency that might have looked cold if you weren't watching his hands. His hands were careful. Zenith noticed that. She noticed it and then told herself she hadn't. She'd taken a half step back during all of this, creating the polite distance of someone who understands they are witnessing something private. She was already calculating the route home in her head, back down Mallard, left on 9th, 12 minutes, when he turned and looked at her. It was not a kind look. It wasn't cruel exactly, it was more precise than that. It was the look of a man who sorted the world into categories quickly and efficiently and had just placed her in one. She saw it happen. The slight adjustment of his gaze, taking in her worn puffer jacket, her escaped braids, her nursing assistant ID still clipped to her lapel, her general existence on this corner in this neighborhood at this hour. She'd been looked at like that before. Sorted and filed in under 3 seconds. She knew the feeling the way she knew the November cold, intimately, without drama. She kept her face still and her chin level. You helped my mother. His English was precise, accent present but controlled, each word placed with intention. I did, Zenith said. She was lost. You took her somewhere and fed her. He said it as a statement, not a question. He'd already been briefed, she realized. Someone had told him. He reached into his jacket and took out his wallet. Zenith watched him open it. Watched him extract bills, several of them, the kind of bills she'd never held in her hand all at once, and hold them out toward her with the smooth, automatic gesture of a man who solved problems with money because money had never once failed to be the solution. For your trouble, he said. The bills sat between them in the cold air. Zenith looked at them. She thought, for a fraction of a second, about her $11.43. About the eviction notice she hadn't found it yet but would in 20 minutes. About the prescription she was stretching. About payday tomorrow and the math she'd been doing all evening. She thought about all of that. Then she looked up at him. No thank you, she said. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that has texture and temperature. The kind that changes the air pressure in a small radius around 2 people. Hyenwa's hand didn't move. The bills were still extended. His expression didn't shift exactly, but something behind his eyes did. A small, almost imperceptible recalibration, like a compass needle that has just encountered an unexpected magnetic field. It's a considerable amount, he said. I can see that. You spent your own money. On a stranger. The faintest edge, not quite condescension, but its first cousin, in the word stranger. I did, Zenith said again. Her voice was even. She was very good at even. And I didn't do it to be paid back. I did it because she needed help. A beat. So. The so landed the way it always did when Zenith used it, as a full stop. A door, politely but completely closed. Hyun-woo looked at her. Really looked, with those fast, comprehensive eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read. Not sorted this time. Actually read. She looked back. She was not, as a rule, easily intimidated. She worked with people at the end of their lives. She had raised herself from 16. She had learned that most people who performed power loudly were protecting something quietly. She didn't know what this man was protecting, but she had no doubt there was something. You're a nurse. He'd clocked the ID badge. Nursing assistant. At Mercy General. Yes. His mother said something in Korean. His eyes moved to her briefly, A flash of something that might have been restraint, then back to Zenith. "My mother says you were kind to her," he said. The words had the quality of something being read from a script he hadn't written and wasn't sure he agreed with. "She says you sat with her and did not make her feel like a burden." "She wasn't a burden." "She is frequently a burden," he said. "To herself and others." Mrs. Choi, who clearly understood English perfectly well when she chose to, made a short sound that was either a cough or a pointed editorial comment. Zenith almost smiled. She controlled it. "She was cold and hungry and lost," Zenith said. "That's not a burden. That's just a person having a hard night." Something moved through his face again. She was beginning to understand that his face was like a lake in winter. Everything was happening under the surface itself barely moved. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he folded the bills back into his wallet and returned it to his jacket with the same smooth efficiency with which he'd drawn it. "My driver will take my mother to her hotel," he said. "Thank you for your assistance." Assistance. Like she was a service. Like the last 45 minutes had been a transaction she'd volunteered for. She felt it, the small, sharp thing that word did, and absorbed it without showing it on her face, because she'd had a lot of practice absorbing small, sharp things without showing them. "Glad she's okay," Zenith said simply. She looked past him to Mrs. Choi, who was watching her with those dark, sharp eyes. And for a moment the old woman's expression was so openly warm, so nakedly grateful, that something in Zenith's chest moved. "Thank you, Zenith," Mrs. Choi said. She said her name carefully, like something worth pronouncing correctly. "Any time, Mrs. Choi." She turned and walked away. She didn't look back. Hyun-woo stood on the pavement and watched her go. He didn't mean to. He meant to turn immediately, to help his mother into the SUV, to call his head of security back and have the conversation about protocol failures that needed to happen. He had a full evening's work still ahead of him. He had things that required his attention. He watched her walk away. The brown puffer jacket. The deliberate pace. The braids catching the light from the bodega sign on the corner. She didn't slow down. Didn't glance back. Walked with the contained, self-possessed energy of someone who needed nothing from him, who had, in fact, just demonstrated that quite clearly. He had offered money. It was what you did. It was how things were resolved, cleanly, transactionally, without remainder. She had said no thank you like it was the simplest thing in the world. He couldn't remember the last time someone had said no to him. He couldn't remember actually, if it had ever happened quite like that, without agenda, without performance, without the particular theater of people who refuse things because they want to be asked again more elaborately. She had just said no and walked away. She is remarkable, isn't she? His mother's voice, beside him. He hadn't heard her approach. She was watching Zenith's retreating figure with an expression he recognized. The look his mother wore when she had decided something and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "She is a stranger," Hyun-woo said. "She is the reason I am warm and fed tonight instead of in a hospital." Mrs. Choi pulled his wool coat tighter around her shoulders. "She spent money she clearly did not have. On me. Without being asked and without expecting anything. I tried to reimburse her." "I know." A pause. She said no. "I noticed." "Did you notice," his mother said, with the patient, deliberate cadence of a woman deploying precision, "why she said no?" Hyun-woo was quiet. "Because it would have made it a transaction," Mrs. Choi continued. "And it was not a transaction. It was a kindness. And you tried to turn it into something you could file away and close." She looked at her son. Looked at him the way only mothers can, which is to say with the full weight of having known someone when they were too young to perform anything. "You do that with everything, Hyun-woo." "Yama." "I am cold," she said, in the tone that ended conversations. "Help me into the car." He did. And as the SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, Hyunwoo sat in the back and looked out the window at the street where she'd been standing. At the empty pavement, the lit bodega sign, the unremarkable corner of an unremarkable block, and felt, in the precise place in his chest where he kept things he refused to examine, something he had no category for. Not curious exactly. Not attraction. He refused to begin down that road. Something smaller and more persistent than either. The sensation, almost physical, of having missed something. Of having looked at a thing and named it incorrectly and walked away knowing, somewhere below the certainty, that you'd gotten it wrong. He pulled out his phone. He had work to return to. He put the phone away. He watched the street until it was gone. Zenith found the eviction notice at 10:43 p.m. It was a single sheet of paper, folded once, slipped under her door, pale yellow, official, with the building management company's logo at the top and a 3-day notice in bold type. She'd been late on rent before. Once 2 years ago by 4 days, and she'd paid the late fee and it had been fine. This was different. Her landlord, Mr. Petrov, had left a handwritten note attached. "Third time this year, Zenith. I like you, but I have to live too. 3 days." She sat on the edge of her bed and read it twice. Her apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen that was technically a corner of the living room, and a bathroom where the hot water took 4 minutes to arrive. She had made it warm with things that cost nothing, a quilt her mother had started and she had finished, photos tucked into the frame of the bathroom mirror, and a small plant on the windowsill that she'd nursed back from near death and considered a personal victory. It was home. It was hers. She sat with the notice in her hands and looked at her plant. Payday tomorrow. $987. Rent is $750. That left $237. There was the late fee, $85 per the lease. That left $152. For 2 weeks. For everything. She could do it. She'd done more with less. She put the notice on her nightstand, changed out of her work clothes, and lay down. She was asleep in 6 minutes. The deep, immediate sleep of a person who has learned that anxiety is a luxury that costs more than you gain from it. But just before sleep took her, in that soft, uncertain border between consciousness and rest, a face appeared without invitation. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes. The way his hands had been careful, just for a second, when he put the coat around his mother. "My mother says you were kind to her." Said like it was a foreign language he was translating from. Zenith pressed her face into her pillow and decided firmly that she was thinking about this because she was overtired. She was asleep before she could argue with herself further. Across the city, on the 38th floor, Hyunwoo stood at his window again. He'd returned to his office. He'd reviewed 3 contracts, sent 12 emails, and taken 1 call from Seoul. He'd done all of this with his usual precision and without any external indication that anything was different. But he kept stopping. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-signature, stopping. And finding himself standing at the window, or staring at the desk without reading what was on it. Finding himself in the strange position of a man whose very reliable mental machinery had developed, without warning or permission, a small but persistent skip. No thank you. 2 words. He'd been told no before. In negotiations. In boardrooms. By governments, by rivals, by men with more power and less patience. He knew how to receive a no and dismantle it. But she hadn't been negotiating. That was the thing. There had been no angle. No positioning. She hadn't said no to be interesting or strategic or to create leverage. She'd said no because she'd meant it, which, he realized, standing there in his $4,000 suit in his $40,000 a month office, was something he genuinely could not remember the last time he'd encountered. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone. He turned from the window, picked up his phone, and did something he'd never done before. He asked his head of security to find a name. The nursing assistant from Mercy General Oncology floor. Her first name is Zenith. Find her last name and her work schedule. He told himself it was due diligence. That she had spent money on his mother and refused reimbursement, and he was simply ensuring that debt was closed through other means. A donation to the hospital in her name, perhaps. An anonymous resolution. Clean. Transactional. He told himself this with complete conviction. He almost believed it. Zenith had a system for not thinking about things. It wasn't avoidance exactly. She'd had a therapist once, briefly, in her early 20s, who'd explained the difference between avoidance and intentional redirection, and Zenith had taken notes. Avoidance was when you pretended the thing didn't exist. Intentional redirection was when you acknowledged the thing, nodded at it politely, and then pointed your full attention somewhere more productive. She was very good at intentional redirection. Wednesday morning, she woke at 6 a.m., made oatmeal with the last of her brown sugar, and sat at her small kitchen table with the eviction notice and a legal pad. She spent 45 minutes making a plan, called her bank about a short-term overdraft option, texted her co-worker Brianna about picking up an extra shift on Saturday, confirmed that her direct deposit had landed at 12:01 a.m. as scheduled. By 7:15 she had a workable path through the next 2 weeks that required no miracles, only discipline. She put the legal pad away. She put the eviction notice in a folder. She braided her hair, put on her uniform, and walked to work. She did not think about dark eyes or charcoal suits or the way a man's hands could be careful for one unguarded second before his face remembered to be cold again. She was very busy not thinking about this. By her lunch break she'd not thought about it approximately 40 times. "You're doing that thing," said Brianna. Brianna Okafor was 31, a registered nurse, and Zenith's closest friend in the way that people who work 12-hour shifts together in high-stakes environments become close, fast, deep, and without much patience for pretense. She was eating a sandwich across from Zenith in the break room and watching her with the particular attention of someone who knew all of her tells. "What thing?" Zenith said, not looking up from her phone. "The thing where you're extremely focused on nothing." Brianna took a bite. "Which means you're actually thinking about something very hard and trying to make it look like you're not." "I'm reading." "Your screen is off." Zenith looked down. Her screen was off. She put her phone face down on the table. "I met someone last night," she said, in the tone of someone making a very minor administrative announcement. Brianna set her sandwich down. "Not like that," Zenith said immediately. "I didn't say anything." "You made a face." "I have a resting, interested face." "Continue." Zenith told her, the bus stop, Mrs. Choi, the noodle shop, the walk toward Western Avenue. She told it plainly, the way she did most things, without editorializing. But when she got to the part where the SUV stopped, she slowed down slightly. And Brianna, who was extremely good at noticing when Zenith slowed down, leaned forward slightly. "He sounds like an ass," Brianna said, when Zenith finished. "He was." Zenith paused. "He was worried about his mother. He just showed it badly." "He tried to pay you like you were hired to help." "Yes." "And you said no." "Obviously." "Good." Brianna picked her sandwich back up. "Forget him." "I have forgotten him." "Okay." A pause. "His mother was sweet though," Zenith said. Brianna looked at her. "I'm just saying she was sweet," Zenith said. "That's all. I hope she's okay." Harm. "Don't harm me." "I would never," Brianna said, humming with her entire face. Zenith looked out the break room window at the gray November sky and told herself with absolute certainty that she was done thinking about Choi Hyunwoo. She lasted the rest of her lunch break. That was something. 38 floors above the city, Hyunwoo was running a meeting. He ran meetings the way he ran everything, with complete authority, minimal waste, and the particular brand of controlled intensity that made his staff perform at levels they didn't know they were capable of. He sat at the head of a long glass table with 7 people arranged down its length and a presentation on the screen behind him, and he moved through agenda items with surgical precision. He had not slept. Nobody in the room knew this because he looked, as always, completely unassailable. Suit immaculate. Expression composed. Voice level and deliberate. He had reviews 3 contracts over breakfast, taken a call with his legal team in Seoul, and approved the final terms of an acquisition that would add $200 million to his portfolio. He was also, underneath all of this, in a state of profound and unfamiliar distraction. No thank you. He stopped the presentation mid-slide. The Whitmore proposal, he said. Walk me through the demographics of their client base again. His head of strategy, a sharp woman named Ms. Park, pulled up the data. Primarily mid-income, ethnically diverse, concentrated in urban markets across. We declined this last quarter, Hyunwoo said. Yes. You felt the client base presented a reputational misalignment. He said it the way he'd said it last quarter, cleanly, definitively. The phrase that meant, in the language of his boardroom, not our kind of people. Ms. Park said nothing. She was good at saying nothing when it was the appropriate response. Hyunwoo looked at the demographic breakdown on the screen. Urban. Diverse. Mid-income. She was cold and hungry and lost. And I could do something about that. He looked at the numbers for a long moment. Put it back on the table, he said. Silence around the glass table, the specific silence of 7 people recalibrating simultaneously. Sir. Ms. Park said. The Whitmore proposal. Put it back on the table for review. He moved on before anyone could respond. Next item. He didn't examine why he'd done it. He moved to the next agenda item and the one after that, and he didn't examine it, the same way he wasn't examining the piece of paper currently in the inside pocket of his jacket. A single sheet on which his head of security had printed a name and a work schedule. Zenith Collins. Mercy General Hospital. Oncology. Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. He hadn't done anything with it yet. He was simply keeping it close for reasons he had not yet defined to himself in language he was willing to use. His mother called at 2 p.m. He almost didn't answer. He was between calls, and his mother's conversations required a particular kind of attention. Not because she rambled, but because she was precise in ways that required you to listen beneath the surface, and today he didn't trust his ability to do that without revealing something. He answered anyway. He always answered his mother. You look tired, she said, which was impressive since this was a phone call. I'm not tired. You answered on the first ring. You always let it go to 3 rings when you're not tired, so you have time to compose yourself before speaking. A pause. You didn't have time today. He said nothing. I have been thinking about Zenith, his mother said. He'd been expecting this. He had been expecting it since 10:43 last night. She's a stranger, Ioma. You said that last night. It was not more true then. She helped you, and I'm grateful. If you'd like, I can make a donation to her hospital. She doesn't want your money. She told you that already. People say they don't want things when they do. Not her. Mrs. Choi's voice was quiet and certain in the way it got when she wasn't debating but simply reporting what she knew. She has no performance in her, Hyunwoo. None. I have spent my life around people performing wealth, performing dignity, performing gratitude and loyalty. That girl performs nothing. What she is, she simply is. A pause. I have not met someone like that in a very long time. Hyunwoo was looking out his window at the city again. I would like to see her again, his mother said. I would like to bring her something. As a proper thank you. Yama. I didn't ask for your permission. I'm telling you my intention, as a courtesy. Another pause, lighter this time. Although if you happen to come with me, that would also be acceptable. I have a company to run. You have a company to hide in, his mother said pleasantly. There is a difference. Good night, Hyunwoo. She hung up. He stood at the window with the dead phone in his hand, and the city spread below him like a circuit board, and the piece of paper with her name on it sat in his jacket pocket, and he stood there for a long time doing exactly what his mother had accused him of and knowing it and doing it anyway because the alternative was something he didn't have a procedure for. He'd built the wall at 19. He knew exactly when, exactly how. His father, Choi Byung-go, founder of what would become the Choi Empire, a man who had been brilliant and visionary and deeply, poisonously small in his personal convictions, had sat him down the week before he left for his first year abroad and delivered what he called a man's education. You will be surrounded by people who are not like us, his father had said. Who do not think like us, work like us, or build like us. They will seem friendly. Some of them will seem extraordinary. Do not be fooled by seeming. Protect what is ours. Trust what we know. The rest is noise. He had been 19 and he had worshipped his father and he had taken those words and built them into architecture. Not a rule, not a prejudice in the way the word was used, but a structure. A way of seeing that sorted the world into reliable and unreliable, known and foreign, worth the risk and not. It had served him well. It had also, though he would not have been able to say this until recently, until perhaps specifically last night, cost him things he hadn't fully inventoried yet. Zenith finished her shift at 9:15 p.m. and walked out into the cold. She'd had a good day actually. A patient on the third floor, a retired teacher named Mr. Eugene, had shown her photos of his grandchildren on his phone for 20 minutes during her rounds, and she'd sat with him and looked at every single one and asked questions, and he'd beamed the whole time. That was the thing about this job that nobody talked about. The small complete moments of genuine human contact. The way they filled something. She was thinking about Mr. Eugene's granddaughter's Halloween costume, a bumblebee, elaborately glittered, and smiling to herself as she turned onto Mallard Street. She stopped. There was a black SUV parked outside Chang's Noodle House. Not the same one, possibly. There were black SUVs all over Chicago. It was a common vehicle. This meant nothing. She walked past it without slowing. And then a voice from behind her, controlled, precise, with an accent she had spent 2 days apparently memorizing without meaning to. Miss Collins. She stopped. She turned around slowly. Choi Hyunwoo was standing on the pavement outside Chang's, his hands in his coat pockets. A different coat tonight, heavy charcoal wool, his expression arranged in the neutral, unreadable configuration she was already starting to recognize as his default setting. He looked, if anything, slightly annoyed to be standing there. Like a man who had arrived at a place his own feet had carried him and was not entirely at peace with that fact. She looked at him for a moment. How do you know my last name? She said. A beat. I have resources. That's a concerning answer. I had my security team. He stopped. Started again. My mother wanted to reach you. To thank you properly. I needed your name too. Your mother could have left a message at the hospital. Another beat. He looked, for a fraction of a second, like a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and had arrived at the one he'd prepared for at least. Yes, he said. She could have. Silence between them. The cold. The lit sign of Chang's reflecting orange on the pavement. So why are you here? Zenith asked. Not unkindly. Just directly. He looked at her. The lake in winter face. Everything is moving underneath. I don't entirely know, he said. It was, she would think later, probably the most honest thing he'd said in years. She looked at him for a long moment. This impossible, complicated man standing on the pavement of Mallard Street like he'd arrived somewhere against his better judgment and hadn't decided yet whether to be glad about it. She should go home. She had an extra shift to prep for. She had $152 and 14 days and a plant on her windowsill counting on her. There's a hot cocoa at Chang's that I've been trying to get to for 2 days, she said. You can tell me what you actually want while I drink it. She walked toward the door. She didn't look back to see if he followed. She didn't need to. She heard his footsteps on the pavement, measured, deliberate, and following. The hot cocoa at Chang's cost $2.50. Hyunwoo paid for it before Zenith could reach her wallet. Not grandly, not with the same energy as the cash he'd extended on the pavement 2 nights ago. Quietly. He simply told Mr. Chong when he ordered his green tea, and it was done, and when Zenith looked at him he met her eyes and said nothing, and she decided to let it be what it was, a small thing, offered without theater. Small things offered without theater were a language she understood. They sat in the same red vinyl booth where she'd sat with Mrs. Choi. She wondered if he knew that. Probably not. She didn't mention it. He sat across from her with his tea and his coat folded beside him and his hands wrapped around the cup in a way that reminded her, with an ache she didn't analyze, of his mother doing the same thing 2 nights ago. The inheritance of gestures. The way the body carries what the mind tries to put down. You wanted to tell me something, she said. I wanted to, he stopped. Reorganized. I behaved poorly the other night. Zenith raised her eyebrows slightly. She hadn't expected that. The money, he said. Offering it like that. It was another stop. He was a man, she was beginning to understand, who spoke with great precision because he was deeply uncomfortable with imprecision, and this subject was refusing to be precise. It was dismissive. It was, she agreed. He looked at her, a flash of something. No offense. More like the expression of someone who'd expected cushioning and received clarity instead, and wasn't sure yet whether to be grateful or unsettled. I'm not in the habit of being told I'm wrong, he said. I know, she said. I could tell. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the shadow a smile leaves when it passes through unfamiliar territory. My mother, he said, has not stopped talking about you. She's a remarkable woman. She is. Said simply, without the complicated parentheses that usually surrounded his references to his mother. Just, she is. She wanted to come herself tonight. I told her I would come instead. Why? The lake in winter face. The stillness. Because I owed you an apology, he said. And I don't send my mother to deliver those. Zenith wrapped both hands around her cocoa and looked at him. Really looked, the way she looked at patients sometimes, not at the chart or the symptom but at the person behind it. She saw the precision that was also armor. The composure was also distant. The extreme, almost architectural quality of his self-control, and the way it made her wonder, with a curiosity she told herself was purely observational, what was inside the architecture. Apology accepted, she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man closing a file. That's not all you wanted to say, she said. He looked at her. You could have sent the apology through your mother, she said. Or through whoever got you my last name. You came yourself. In person. To a noodle shop on Mallard Street. She tilted her head slightly. So again. He was beginning to understand it as a Zenith Collins punctuation mark, a small door, held open. He looked at his tea. I find myself, he said slowly, curious about you. Curious how? In ways I haven't, he stopped. I don't typically find myself curious about people. I find myself needing information about people, which is a different thing. What they want, what they're capable of, where their loyalties lie." He paused. "What you did the other night, spending money you clearly didn't have, refusing reimbursement, walking her 6 blocks and asking nothing." He looked up. "That doesn't fit a framework I'm familiar with." "Maybe your framework is the problem." The sentence landed quietly, without aggression. He absorbed it the way he seemed to absorb most things. Still, completely, without visible reaction. But his fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "Maybe," he said. They sat with that for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Zenith said. "You're going to regardless." "Probably," she agreed. "Why did you come to Chicago?" "Your mother said she was visiting your office here. But your company is headquartered in Seoul." "We have a Chicago division. I oversee it quarterly." "But you came in person this quarter." He looked at her steadily. "I come in person every quarter." "Okay," she said, in a tone that indicated she wasn't entirely sure she believed this, but was willing to let it stand. He almost smiled again. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about anything large. Not about his empire or her eviction notice or the complicated gravitational pull that had apparently replaced the November cold as the primary atmospheric condition of Mallard Street. They talked about small things. She told him about Mr. Eugene and the bumblebee granddaughter. He told her, with the air of a man surprised to hear himself speaking, about a restaurant in Seoul near his first office. A tiny basement place that made one dish, a specific kind of braised tofu, and he'd eaten there every day for 2 years. She asked what happened to it. He said it was closed. She said she was sorry. He said it was a long time ago. She said that didn't always matter. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." When she stood to leave, he stood too, automatic, instinctive, the deep programmed manners of a very specific kind of upbringing. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed and said nothing. "Your mother can come to the hospital if she wants," Zenith said, pulling on her puffer jacket. "I work Wednesday and Friday. She doesn't need an appointment." He looked at her. "Tell her I said she's welcome," Zenith said. And then, with the small precise pause of someone making a deliberate choice, "You're welcome too. If you find yourself curious again." She walked out. He stood in the fluorescent light of Chang's noodle house and looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Mr. Chong, polishing a glass behind the counter, glanced over at him. "She comes in every week," Mr. Chong offered conversationally. "Always the cocoa. Sometimes the soup if it's been a hard day. Good girl." He went back to polishing. "You should tip." Hyun-woo left $40 on the table. Mrs. Choi arrived at Mercy General on Friday. She arrived at 11 a.m., Zenith's midshift, with a shopping bag from a Korean grocery that contained a container of homemade japchae, a small jar of kimchi, 2 mandarin oranges, and a packet of honey citron tea. She presented herself at the oncology floor reception desk with the composed authority of a woman accustomed to being received, and asked for Zenith Collins. The receptionist, a young man named Desmond who was not prepared for this particular Friday, paged Zenith with slightly more urgency than the message required. Zenith came out of room 14 to find Mrs. Choi sitting in one of the waiting area chairs with her shopping bag on her lap and her posture immaculate, wearing a proper coat this time, deep burgundy wool, and looking entirely at home in a way that seemed to adjust the room around her rather than adjusting to it. Zenith stopped in the middle of the corridor. Something warm moved through her chest. Uninvited. Entirely welcome. "Mrs. Choi," she said. "I brought lunch," Mrs. Choi said, holding up the bag. "I hope you have a break." "I'll do it in 20 minutes. "I will wait." "You don't have to." "I know," said pleasantly but definitively, in the tone that Zenith was beginning to understand, signaled that the conversation about whether Mrs. Choi had to do something was over. Zenith smiled. She went back to room 14. She came back in 18 minutes. They ate in the break room, Zenith and Brianna and Mrs. Choi, and it was one of the stranger and more delightful combinations Zenith could remember, the three of them around the small break room table with containers of japchae and Brianna's questions and Mrs. Choi's precise, dry answers. Brianna asked how old she was. Mrs. Choi told her it was a question of limited relevance. Brianna said she respected that. Mrs. Choi said she could tell and seemed to mean it as a compliment. Your son, Brianna said, with the casual devastation of someone who is asking something pointed while sounding conversational, is he as intense in person as he sounds? Mrs. Choi looked at Zenith. Zenith looked at her japchae. My son, Mrs. Choi said carefully, is a person who learned very young to put his feelings in a box and sit on the lid. He has become very good at sitting. He is less good at everything else. She paused. He gets that from his father. Sitting on the lids. And the intensity? Brianna asked. That he gets from me, Mrs. Choi said, without any apology. I have passed on worse things. Zenith looked up at that. Found Mrs. Choi looking at her with those dark, reading eyes. Held the look for a moment, then looked away. He came to see me Wednesday night, Zenith said, to the japchae. To apologize. I know, Mrs. Choi said. You know. He told me. A small pause. He tells me very little, so when he volunteers something, I pay attention. She set her chopsticks down neatly. He said you talked for almost an hour. 40 minutes. He said almost an hour. Mrs. Choi's eyes were warm. He was rounding up. He never rounds up. Zenith opened her mouth. The break room door opened. Choi Hyun-woo walked in. The three of them looked at him. He looked at the three of them. A silence descended on the break room that had several distinct layers: surprise, recognition, and something that lived specifically between Zenith and Hyun-woo and had no name yet but was taking up considerable atmospheric space. You said she was at the hospital, he said to his mother, in the tone of a man who had rehearsed a reasonable explanation for his presence and was now aware it had become unnecessary. I did, Mrs. Choi said. You didn't say you were coming yourself. You didn't ask. She gestured at the empty chair beside her. Sit. There is japchae. Hyun-woo looked at the chair. Looked at Zenith, who was looking at him with an expression that was carefully neutral and slightly amused and very much aware of everything happening in this room. Looked at Brianna, who was not being careful at all and was watching him with the open evaluative attention of a woman gathering data in real time. He sat. He did not have japchae. He accepted green tea from the break room machine with the expression of a man managing his circumstances. Brianna introduced herself with the firm handshake of someone establishing terms. He shook it without flinching, which Brianna later told Zenith she respected. The break room table was small. The space was, by any objective measure, too small for what was in it. Zenith was acutely, involuntarily aware of the specific distance between her left hand and his right, which were both resting on the table approximately 8 inches apart. She moved her hand to her lap. He said nothing. But she'd seen him notice. Zenith tells me she almost didn't stop to help me, Mrs. Choi said conversationally. I didn't say that, Zenith said. You said a voice told you to keep walking. I said there was a practical argument for it. I didn't listen to it. But you heard it, Mrs. Choi said, with the precision of a woman who found the distinction important. She looked at her son. She heard the argument for walking past a cold, hungry old woman in the dark, and she chose against it. Not because she didn't understand the argument. Because she had a different priority. Hyun-woo looked at Zenith. Zenith looked at Mrs. Choi. Are you making a point? I'm having a conversation, Mrs. Choi said innocently. Brianna made a sound into her tea that she converted, admirably, into a cough. Zenith's break ended. She stood, gathered the containers, told Mrs. Choi she didn't need to clean up, was overruled, thanked Brianna for sharing her break room, and picked up her badge from the table. I'll walk out with you, Hyunwoo said. It wasn't a question. Not quite. It was that thing he did, the sentence that was structurally a statement but functionally a door, held slightly open. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. They walked out of the break room and into the corridor, the long linoleum-floored hallway of the oncology ward with its particular quiet, its particular quality of light. He walked beside her at a pace that matched hers exactly, and she noticed this, the adjustment, the calibration. He moved like someone used to setting the pace for rooms, unconsciously recalibrating for her without drawing attention to it. She slowed slightly, experimentally. He slowed. She looked straight ahead and said nothing about this. She does that, he said, after a moment. What? Make points through conversation. I have been doing it since I was 8. A pause. She's usually right. I don't always tell her that. You should tell her more often. Probably. He glanced at her sideways. She likes you. I like her. She doesn't like many people. He said it without inflection, just information. She grew up in a world with a lot of performance and very few real people. She became selective. A pause. I think I inherited that too. The selectivity. There's a difference, Zenith said, between being selective and building a wall and calling it taste. She said it gently. But she said it. He was quiet for 3 steps. 4. You do that, he said. Do what? Say the exact thing. A beat. Most people don't. Most people want something from you, she said. I don't. So I can just say things. He stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face him. They were in the middle of the corridor, the ward's particular quiet around them, the distant sound of a monitoring machine, and the soft footsteps of a nurse 2 rooms down. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the lake in winter. Not the assessing sort. Something more open than either. Something that looked almost like recognition, the specific expression of a person encountering an answer to a question they'd stopped believing had one. You really don't, he said quietly. Want anything? I want plenty of things, she said. Just not from you. She met his eyes. Not yet, anyway. The yet arrived in the corridor between them and sat down and made themselves comfortable. She held his gaze for one more moment. Long enough to make sure he'd heard it, not so long that she had to deal with whatever his face was doing, and then she turned back toward room 14. Mrs. Choi can stay as long as she wants, she said over her shoulder. There's more tea. She went back to work. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he put both hands in his coat pockets, turned, and walked back toward the break room. Brianna was waiting in the doorway. Just so you know, Brianna said, in the pleasant tone of a woman who has decided to be very clear, if you hurt her, I will make your life difficult in ways that your security team is not equipped to handle. He looked at her. I believe you, he said. Brianna studied him for a long moment. Good, she said, and went back inside. Mrs. Choi was still at the table, hands folded, expression serene, in the manner of a woman who has set something in motion and is waiting with perfect patience for it to arrive. He sat down across from her. You planned this, he said. I brought japchae, she said. You planned this. She poured him more tea from the break room machine, which he had not asked for, and set it in front of him with the small, composed smile of someone who has been outmaneuvering people for 67 years and remains very good at it. She said not yet, he said. His mother looked up. When I said she doesn't want anything from me. He looked at the table. She said, "Not yet." Mrs. Choi was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Briefly, completely, in the way she'd done when he was a boy and needed to be reminded that he was seen. "That is the first honest thing you've told me about her," she said. He said nothing. "Hyun-woo." Her voice was quiet. "When was the last time someone said not yet to you and you wanted to wait?" He looked at his mother's hand over his. Outside in the corridor, the oncology ward continued its particularly sacred quiet. People fighting their battles, a nurse moving room to room, and a son holding his father's hand behind a closed door. Life at its most essential, most stripped of performance. He didn't answer his mother's question out loud. But he stayed for another hour. It became a routine before either of them named it as one. That was the thing about routines. They didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly, through repetition, through the small accumulated weight of things that kept happening until they became expected. Until their absence would be the notable thing. Mrs. Choi came to the hospital on Wednesdays and Fridays. She always brought food. Not always Korean. Once she brought a container of jollof rice from a West African place near her hotel that she'd walked past and decided, on instinct, to try. She presented it to Zenith with the expression of someone submitting work for review. Zenith took one bite and closed her eyes. Mrs. Choi watched her with visible satisfaction. "Good?" she asked. "Mrs. Choi, this is extraordinary." "I thought so. The woman who runs it, she reminds me of you." "She has the same," she gestured vaguely at Zenith's general presence. "The same quality of not needing the room to know she's in it." Zenith looked at her. "That is a compliment," Mrs. Choi said. "I know," Zenith said. "Thank you." They had developed in the space of 2 weeks, the particular ease of people who have skipped the performative early stages of friendship and arrived directly at something real. Mrs. Choi asked questions directly and listened to the answers with complete attention. Zenith answered directly and asked questions back with the same care. Between them there was no pretense, no social cushioning, and no performance. It was, Mrs. Choi thought privately, the most comfortable she had felt in years. It was, Zenith thought privately and would not fully examine, starting to feel like something she hadn't had since she was 16. Hyun-woo came on Fridays. He came, ostensibly, because his mother was there and he had concerns about her navigating the city alone, which was an argument she had dismissed 3 times with increasing elegance. He came anyway. He sat in the break room or the waiting area and worked from his phone with the focused efficiency of a man who could run a $4.2 billion empire from a plastic chair in a hospital corridor, and he was there when Zenith's break happened, and they talked. They talked in the specific way of 2 people who have decided, without formally deciding, to be honest with each other. He asked about her patients, not the details which she couldn't share, but the shape of the work, the emotional texture of it. She told him about what it meant to be present with people at the edge of things. He listened in a way that was visibly different from how she imagined he usually listened. Not for information, not for leverage, but just listening. She asked about soul. About what it had been like to build something from a foundation someone else laid. He answered carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all, which she suspected was rare for him. "Do you ever resent it?" she asked once. "The inheritance. Being handed an empire with expectations already built in." He was quiet for a long moment. "I used to think resentment was a word for people who couldn't perform well enough to transcend their circumstances," he said. "My father believed that. Work hard enough and the circumstances become irrelevant. And now I think my father used that belief to avoid examining his circumstances." A pause. "Which is different." She looked at him steadily. "That took courage to say." "It took you asking," he said. "Which is different." She smiled at that. Not the small controlled almost smile she gave most things, but a real one, sudden and full. He went very still when she smiled that way. She'd noticed he did that. She'd filed it carefully in a place she wasn't examining yet. The Friday that everything shifted was the second week of December. Chicago had finally committed to winter. Real winter, with actual snow on the ground and ice on the pavement and the kind of cold that made the air taste like metal. Mrs. Choi arrived at 11 a.m. with her shopping bag and her burgundy coat and took her usual seat in the break room to wait for Zenith's break. But Zenith was running late. A patient had needed her specifically, and she didn't rush those moments. So it was almost 1 p.m. by the time she came into the break room and found Mrs. Choi sitting alone with cold tea and a look on her face that Zenith hadn't seen before. Not the composed look. Not the dry, sharp-eyed look. Something quieter. Something old. Mrs. Choi. Zenith sat down. "Are you okay?" A pause. Longer than usual. "I was looking at the photographs," Mrs. Choi said. She nodded at the bulletin board on the break room wall, the one covered in staff photos, patient thank you cards, a few children's drawings from the pediatric floor 2 levels down. "There is one there, a little girl in a yellow dress." Zenith looked. She knew the photo. It was from a thank you card hand-drawn, a child's rendering of a nurse and a patient, with a real photograph stapled alongside, a small girl, maybe 7, in a yellow dress, grinning with the uninhibited completeness only children manage. "She reminded you of someone?" Zenith said gently. Mrs. Choi's hands, folded on the table, tightened slightly. "I had a daughter," she said. Zenith went still. "Her name was Sujin." Mrs. Choi said the name carefully, the way you say something precious. She would have been 31 this year. She was 7 when she died. A car accident. Very quick. The doctors said she did not suffer. A small pause. "I have always held on to that. That she did not suffer." The break room was very quiet. "I'm so sorry," Zenith said. Not the reflexive sorry, the real one. Said simply, without decoration, because Mrs. Choi was not a woman who needed decoration. Hyunwoo was 12, Mrs. Choi continued. He adored her. She followed him everywhere, drove him mad, the way younger siblings do, but he adored her. She looked at her hands. After she died he went very quiet. Very internal. And then his father took that quiet and built a framework around it. Taught him that the quiet was strength. That feeling openly was a weakness. Her voice was steady, but Zenith could hear, underneath it, the particular steadiness of someone who had been practicing for a long time. I let him. I didn't know how to grieve myself, so I let his father shape his grief into something that looked like character. She looked up. I have regretted that for 22 years. Zenith reached across the table. She put her hand over Mrs. Choi's. The same gesture, Zenith didn't know, that Mrs. Choi had given her son in this same room 2 weeks ago. Can I tell you something? Zenith said. Mrs. Choi turned her hand over beneath Zenith's. Held it. My mother died when I was 16, Zenith said. Breast cancer. 14 months from diagnosis too, she paused. Let the pause be what it was. My father left when I was 12. He wasn't a bad man. He just had the kind of emotional capacity that worked fine in ordinary weather and completely failed in storms. My mother's illness was a storm he didn't know how to stand in. She looked at her hands briefly. He moved to Detroit. We talk on birthdays sometimes. It's what it is. She looked back up. So when she died, yes. It was just me. I finished high school, got into a nursing program, and worked through it. She looked at their hands on the table. People used to tell me I was so strong, so resilient. And I'd smile and say thank you, because that was what they needed to hear. She looked up. But what I actually was just a girl who missed her mother so much she didn't know what to do with it, so she poured it into taking care of other people instead. Because that was the only way to be near the feeling without being destroyed by it. The break room was very, very quiet. Mrs. Choi's eyes had gone bright. Not with tears exactly, with something adjacent to tears. The pressure of them was held back by the same long practice that kept her voice steady. She would have liked you, Mrs. Choi said softly. My mother. Yes. And Sujin. A pause. My daughter. She liked everyone who was real. She had a gift for finding realness. She squeezed Zenith's hand. I think she would have found you very quickly. Zenith's throat tightened. And your mother, Mrs. Choi said, would be so proud of who you became. Zenith looked down at the table. She didn't speak for a moment. She was doing the thing she'd learned to do, letting the feeling pass through instead of routing it around. It took a moment. Thank you, she said, when she could say it without it costing too much. That means more than you know. Neither of them heard the door. It had opened 6 inches, enough for a man to stop in the act of entering, to see what was happening at the table, and to choose without deciding consciously to stay very still and not announce himself. Hyun-woo had arrived early. 20 minutes early, which was not something he examined. He'd been in the building, finished his calls, and walked to the oncology floor. He'd been about to push open the break room door when he heard his mother's voice saying a name she almost never said out loud. Sujin. He'd stopped. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the door, and listened to his mother tell a story he had not heard her tell. Not in 22 years, not in this form, not with this quiet openness that suggested she was not performing composure but actually feeling something and allowing it. And then he listened to Zenith. Just a girl who missed her mother so much she didn't know what to do with it, so she poured it into taking care of other people instead. He stood in the doorway. In his chest, something that had been sealed for 22 years, sealed with the efficiency of a man who had been taught that sealing things was the same as surviving them, shifted. Not broken. Not yet. But shifted, the way a structure shifts when the ground beneath it moves, the way you can hear the change before you see it. He thought about Sujin. He rarely let himself think about Sujin. He had a system. The same system Zenith had, he realized, only pointed in a different direction. She poured the feeling into other people. He put it in a box and built a company on top of it and called the company his life. He thought about a 7-year-old in pigtails who used to steal food off his plate and deny it with the boldest, most transparent lies he'd ever encountered. Who used to fall asleep during family movie nights and have to be carried, by him, always by him, because she'd established early that she preferred him for carrying, to her room. Whose hand had he been holding when the car left the road? He had never told anyone that last part. Not his father. Not his mother. Not the therapist his father had hired for 3 months and then discontinued because he felt the boy was becoming too focused on feelings at the expense of resilience. He held Sujin's hand. And then he hadn't. He stood in the doorway of a hospital break room in Chicago and for the first time in 22 years let himself think about that for more than 3 seconds before shutting it down. He didn't shut it down. He stood there and let it be what it was. He must have made a sound. Or moved. Or perhaps Mrs. Choi simply always knew when he was in a room. Mothers develop senses that have no clinical name. She looked up. Their eyes met across the break room. His mother and her son, across a small table in a fluorescent room, with Zenith's hand still over Mrs. Choi's and the name Sujin still in the air. His mother's face did something he hadn't seen it do in a very long time. It opened. Not with pity, she knew better than that. With recognition. With the specific tenderness of a person seeing someone they love finally stop pretending. He looked at Zenith. She had looked up too. She was watching him with those direct, careful eyes. reading him the way she read her patients, not the chart but the person. He was aware, suddenly and completely, that she saw everything on his face right now. That the lake in winter had thawed in the last 60 seconds and whatever was underneath it was visible. He let it be visible. It cost him something. He noted the cost without pulling back from it. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was slightly different. She heard it. He heard it. I wasn't trying to." "Sit down, Hyunwoo," his mother said gently. He sat. Not at the end of the table, beside his mother. Close, in a way he wasn't normally. She didn't comment on it. She simply moved her tea to make room and let him be there. They sat in the quiet of the break room, the three of them, with 2 losses and 1 room and the strange grace of having named hard things out loud and survived the naming. "She would have been 31, Hyunwoo said. Quietly. To the table, mostly, though they were both there to hear it. Soo-jin. She would have," he stopped. "She wanted to be a marine biologist. She was obsessed with octopuses. She thought they were," the corner of his mouth moved. "She called them the most honest animals. Because they had no bones and didn't pretend to be harder than they were." Mrs. Choi made a sound that was entirely undignified and entirely human and covered her mouth with one hand. Zenith looked at Hyunwoo. "She sounds wonderful," she said. "She was the best person I've ever known," he said. Simply. Without the armor. Just true. Zenith felt the full weight of that sentence. Felt it in the part of her that understood exactly what it meant to lose someone who was the best person you'd ever known and spend the rest of your life being vaguely measured against their absence. "Tell me something else about her," Zenith said. He looked at her. "You don't have to," she said. "But I'd like to know. If you want to tell me." The break room hummed. The hospital continued its sacred work around them. December pressed cold and white against the window above the sink. He told her about Soo-jin. He told her about the stolen food and the transparent lies. About the carrying. About the way she'd narrated her own bedtime stories out loud as she was falling asleep, elaborate ongoing sagas that she'd pick up exactly where she'd left them the next night. He talked for 12 minutes and his mother cried silently and beautifully beside him and didn't try to hide it. And Zenith listened with the full, complete, unhurried attention she gave everything that mattered. When he stopped, the silence was different from the one that had preceded the telling. Fuller. Cleaner. The silence of a room from which something long held has finally been released. "Thank you," Mrs. Choi said to Zenith, eventually. "For this." She gestured slightly at the room at her son. "For creating the condition." "I didn't do anything," Zenith said. "You listened," Mrs. Choi said. "Do not underestimate that. Most people hear. Very few listen." Hyunwoo was looking at Zenith in a way he hadn't looked at her before. Hadn't looked at anyone before, probably. The assessing look was gone. The sorting was gone. What was left was something undefended and very quiet. A man standing in his own wreckage and finding, with some surprise, that the ground beneath it was still solid. "Your mother," he said. "What was she like?" Zenith blinked. No one asked that. People asked how her mother died and when her mother died and offered condolences that were really about their own discomfort with mortality. No one asked what she was like. She was, Zenith started, and felt her throat tighten, and kept going. She was warm. Like, genuinely, physically warm. She always ran hot and drove my dad crazy in summer. She was funny in this very quiet way, where the joke would land and then she'd just look at you with this expression like, I know, I'm hilarious. She was a home health aide. She cared for old people. She used to say, Zenith smiled, and it moved through her whole face. She used to say, Zenith, everybody deserves to have someone in their corner. Even at the end. Especially at the end. The room was quiet. That is why you do this, Mrs. Choi said softly. Not a question. That's why I do this, Zenith said. Hyunwoo looked at her for a long time. And then he said, quietly, without decoration, in the tone of someone saying something they've just understood for the first time. She's still in your corner. Zenith looked at him sharply. Your mother, he said. She's still in your corner. What she gave you, the way you move through the world, she's still doing it. Through you. Zenith opened her mouth. And closed it. Looked down at the table for a moment, because she needed a moment, and he gave it to her without filling it. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. Yeah, she said softly. She is. Something had changed in the room. In the air. In the specific calibration of 3 people around a small table in a fluorescent break room in December. Mrs. Choi looked at her son. Her son was looking at Zenith Collins like a man who has spent 22 years building walls and has just discovered, without warning, that one of them has a door. Mrs. Choi said nothing. She picked up her tea and drank it and said absolutely nothing, and she was so quietly, completely happy that she had to look at the bulletin board photograph, the little girl in the yellow dress, to keep her face from giving the entire thing away. He came on a Tuesday. Zenith didn't work on Tuesdays. She was at her kitchen table in her old university sweatshirt and thick socks, surrounded by the particular organized chaos of a person doing serious budgeting. Her laptop open to her bank account, a legal pad covered in numbers, and a cup of tea going cold beside her elbow. The eviction situation had been resolved, barely, and with the specific indignity of having to knock on Mr. Petrov's door on a Saturday morning with an envelope and an explanation. He'd taken the envelope, looked at her for a long moment over his reading glasses, and said, "You're a good tenant, Zenith. Just, don't make me do that again." She'd said she wouldn't. She'd meant it. The money had come from 3 places: her extra Saturday shift, a loan from Brianna, offered before being asked, accepted after 15 minutes of resistance, and one firm, Zenith, I have it and you need it, so let's not make this a whole thing. And the careful redistribution of every non-essential dollar she could find. She'd transferred Brianna's portion back 11 days later, on the morning of her next payday, with a text that said, "Paid in full. Thank you. I mean it." Brianna had replied with a single line, "I know you do. Now stop thanking me." She was still smiling about that. She was still here. The plant on the windowsill was still here. Small mercies. She was recalculating her January budget when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Chicago area code. She almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct, curiosity, the specific frequency of a feeling she wasn't naming yet, made her pick up. It's Hyunwoo. She sat back in her chair. How do you have this number? A pause. My mother. Your mother has my number? You gave it to her in case she got lost again. Another pause. The kind that meant he was aware of how this sounded. She gave it to me. Did she know she was giving it to you, or did you just? She knew, he said. Then, she offered it. She's been orchestrating. I'm aware, Zenith said. She's not subtle. She's extremely subtle, Zenith said. You just know her too well to miss it. A beat. Then something happened on the phone that took her a moment to identify because she hadn't heard it from him before. A short, quiet sound. Almost a laugh. Not performed. Real. She looked at her plant. I'm not working today, she said. I know. My mother told me your schedule. A pause. Which I recognize sounds. I'm aware of how that sounds. Hum. I wanted to ask if you'd like to, he stopped. She had the vivid, clear image of him standing somewhere very clean and expensive, working through the phrasing of this sentence with the same precision he applied to contracts. If you had time. To get coffee. Or, whatever you prefer. Are you asking me to spend time with you, Hyunwoo? The pause this time was different. Shorter. Like a man deciding to stop overthinking. Yes, he said. Okay, she said. He picked her up at noon. No SUV this time. He drove himself, which she suspected was significant without being able to fully explain why. A dark gray car, understated by his standards, which still meant it cost more than her annual salary. He was in dark jeans and a black coat and no tie, and the absence of the tie did something to his overall architecture. Made him look less like a structure and more like a person. She was in her good jeans, her brown boots, and a burgundy sweater she'd had for 4 years and loved unreasonably. She'd told herself 3 times that she was not dressing for this and then spent 11 minutes on her edges. He opened the car door. Not performatively, just did it naturally before she could reach the handle. She got in without commenting. He drove like he did everything, with complete attention and no wasted movement. They went north, away from her neighborhood, into a part of the city she knew but didn't frequent. The kind of area where the architecture got more interesting and the coffee shops had exposed brick and single-origin pour-overs and no fluorescent lighting. He took her to a bookshop. Not a coffee shop with books as decor, an actual independent bookshop, the kind with narrow aisles and a resident cat and handwritten staff recommendation cards tucked into shelves. It smelled like paper and wood and the particular warmth of central heating working hard against December. She stopped 2 steps inside the door. A bookshop, she said. You mentioned, he stopped. In the break room, 3 weeks ago. You said when you were a girl your mother used to take you to the library every Saturday. You said it was the only place you felt like everything you needed was in one room. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the shelves, not at her, in the manner of a man who has just revealed that he has been paying very close attention and is managing the vulnerability of that. You remembered that, she said. I remember most things. That was a small thing. Not to me, he said, still looking at the shelves. She looked at the side of his face for a moment. Then she turned to the nearest shelf and ran her fingers along the spines and said nothing, because some things are better received in silence than in words, and this was one of them. They spent 2 hours in the bookshop. Not browsing politely, actually exploring. She went to fiction immediately, the way she always had, and he followed with the hesitant interest of someone who read primarily for information and was slightly suspicious of reading for other reasons. She pulled books off shelves and handed them to him with brief, decisive verdicts. This one will make you think differently about silence. This one is about a man who builds things to avoid feeling things. Relevant. This one is just purely beautiful, no agenda. He held the stack of books she kept handing him with the expression of a man who had not expected to be educated today and was recalibrating. Have you read all of these? He asked. Most of them twice. When? You work 4 days a week, 12-hour shifts. I read on transit. I read on breaks. I read when I can't sleep. She pulled another book, looked at the back, and put it back. Reading is how I refill. Refill. From the pouring out. She glanced at him. You must have something like that. Something that refills you. He thought about it seriously. She could see him thinking, the specific quality of attention he brought to questions he considered worth answering honestly. Architecture, he said finally. Looking at buildings. Not the ones I own. Old ones, buildings that have survived things. I walk around cities and look at what's still standing and think about what made it last. She looked at him. That is the most revealing thing you've said about yourself, she said. He looked back at her. Is it? A man who runs an empire looking at old buildings and thinking about what makes things last. She tilted her head. That's not a hobby. That's a question you're asking yourself. He was quiet for a moment. Perhaps, he said. What's your answer so far? He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she felt the specific warmth of being looked at carefully, Not sorted, not assessed. Seen. I'm updating it, he said. They found a small cafe attached to the back of the bookshop. 4 tables, a chalkboard menu, and a teenager behind the counter who was clearly doing homework between customers. Zenith ordered tea. Hyunwoo ordered black coffee. They sat at the table closest to the window, and the conversation moved the way it had been moving for weeks. Freely, without the usual social scaffolding people use when they haven't decided to trust someone yet. She'd noticed they'd both skipped that stage. Neither of them had done the careful, managed small talk of early connection. From their first 40 minutes in Chang's, they'd been talking like people who'd run out of patience for performance. She didn't know if that was her or him or something the two of them made together. She suspected it was the third thing. Tell me about growing up, he said. Before your mother died. She looked at him. Nobody asked that either. You ask good questions, she said. I've had practice asking bad ones. You learn the difference. She smiled. We were comfortable, I think is the word. Not wealthy, not struggling. My dad worked at the post office. My mom did home care. We had a house. Not big but ours. My mom cooked every Sunday like it was a project she cared about. The whole neighborhood knew when she was making stew because you could smell it 3 doors down. She wrapped her hands around her tea. She sang while she cooked. Badly. Enthusiastically. Without any awareness of the gap between those two things. He was listening with his complete attention. Coffee forgotten, phone in his pocket, eyes on her. She sounds joyful, he said. She was the most joyful person I've ever known. Zenith paused. Not happy, joyful. Happiness is about circumstances. Joy is about orientation. How you're facing things. She faced everything with this fundamental okayness. Like, whatever was happening, somewhere underneath it was something that was okay. Did she know she was sick? Before the diagnosis? I think so. I think she knew something was wrong for a while before she went to the doctor. Zenith's voice was steady. I think she was protecting me. Waiting until she had information she could manage. A pause. I've spent a lot of years being simultaneously furious at her for that and completely understanding why she did it. Both things are true at once, he said. Both things are true at once, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I have spent a long time, he said slowly, believing that emotions were most useful when they were resolved. Filed. Completed. He looked at his coffee. I'm beginning to think that it's not how they work. That some things are just both things at once and the work isn't resolving them into one. It's just carrying both. She looked at him. That is a significant shift, she said softly. From where you started. Where did I start? Handing a woman money on a street corner and calling it gratitude. He held her eyes. Yes, he said. It is. The afternoon deepened. The light outside the window shifted from the flat gray of noon to the warmer, more golden gray of a December afternoon, the sky doing its best with what it had. They ordered more drinks and stayed. The teenager behind the counter finished his homework and started a new assignment and glanced at them occasionally with the specific lack of interest of youth. They talked about Seoul. About Chicago. About what it meant to build a life in a city that wasn't the one that made you. She told him about her first apartment after her mother died. A single room she'd rented for $450 a month, with a window that faced a brick wall and a radiator that made sounds she described as operatic. He told her about the first office of his company. A space he'd insisted on establishing independently of his father, a calculated act of autonomy that had taken him 3 years to execute and had cost him in ways he was still, perhaps, calculating. He didn't approve. She asked. He approved of the enterprise. He disapproved of the implication. A pause. That his way wasn't the only way. Was he right? His way. Hyun-woo considered this with his characteristic honesty. He built something significant, he said carefully. He built it through methods I have, continued some of and rejected others. He was right about discipline. About vision. About the willingness to make decisions that cost you something in the short term for a longer return. He paused. He was wrong about people. About what they are and what they're worth and which categories they belong in. He said it plainly. Not with self-flagellation. He'd examined it and arrived at a conclusion and was stating it. But she heard what was underneath it. The specific difficulty of saying out loud that someone you loved was wrong. That something you were given as truth was not. When did you realize? She asked. That he was wrong about people? He looked at her directly. Recently, he said. The word landed between them and stayed. She held his gaze and felt, clearly without ambiguity, the specific gravity of this moment. The way it was tilting toward something. The way they were both aware of the tilt and neither of them was correcting it. Hyun-woo, she said. Yes. What are we doing? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, December pressed against the window. The bookshop's cat walked across the back of an empty chair with the supreme indifference of someone who belongs everywhere. I don't know, he said. I'm not sure I've ever done this before. Done what? This. He gestured slightly, at the table, the cups, the afternoon, and the two of them. Whatever this is. Without a category for it. Without knowing what I want to make of it and working backward from there. He looked at her. I always know what I want to make of things. And you don't know now. I know what I want, he said, after a pause. I don't know if I deserve it. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. I know. I'm going to need you to keep being that honest, she said. I don't do well with people who manage me. Who calculates what to show and what to put away. I've been managed by circumstances my whole life. I won't be managed by a person. I know that about you. Do you? Yes. No hesitation. You are the least manageable person I've ever encountered. I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. She laughed. It happened suddenly, the real laugh, the one he'd heard once before, that arrived without warning and transformed her whole face. He went still when she laughed. She caught it this time, caught the stillness and the reason for it, and felt warmth move through her that she no longer told herself was something else. Okay, she said, when the laugh had settled into a smile. Okay. Okay, we can keep doing this. She wrapped her hands around her cup. Whatever this is. Without a category. Without working backward from a desired outcome. She tilted her head. But Hyun-woo, honesty is not optional. The moment I feel like you're managing me, I'm done. I'm not a situation to be handled. You are not, he said. You are the most, he stopped. He looked at her. You are unlike anything I have ever encountered. And I have encountered a great deal. High bar, she said. Highest I know, he said simply. He drove her home at 6 p.m. He parked outside her building, the worn brick facade, the buzzer panel with half the names missing, and the potted plant someone had optimistically left by the front door and then abandoned to the November cold. He looked at it without comment, because he'd learned that she didn't need her circumstances commented on. She unbuckled her seatbelt and didn't immediately move. Today was, she paused, really good. Yes, he said. The bookshop was a good call. You mentioned the library. You remembered. I remember, he said, everything you say. I want you to know that. She looked at him in the low light of the car. the gray December evening outside, the warmth inside, and the specific charged quiet of two people at the end of an afternoon that has changed something. "I'm going to go inside," she said. "Yes. Before I do." She turned toward him slightly. "The thing you said, about not knowing if you deserve it." She held his eyes. Deserving isn't a fixed state. It's not something you have or don't have. It's something you're in the process of. She paused. "You're in the process, Hyunwoo. I can see that." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. Quiet. Real. She got out of the car. She was halfway up the front steps when she heard the window lower behind her. Zenith. She turned. He was leaning slightly toward the open window, and his face had the open, undefended look she'd first seen in the break room doorway, and he said, "Next Tuesday." She looked at him for a moment. "Next Tuesday," she said. She went inside. She stood in the elevator going up to the 4th floor with both hands pressed flat against her stomach, feeling something that was warm and terrifying and large. Feeling it fully without routing around it, and by the time she reached her door, she was smiling in the particular way of someone who has stopped pretending they're not. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat on her bed and picked up her phone and called Brianna. "I think I'm in trouble," she said, when Brianna answered. "Oh, I know," Brianna said, with extreme satisfaction. "Tell me everything." Across the city, Hyunwoo sat outside her building for 4 minutes before he drove away. He drove back to his hotel, not the tower, not the office, and sat in the quiet of a room that cost $900 a night and had views he never looked at, and he thought about a bookshop and a woman who handed him books and said relevant and laughed without warning and told him that deserving wasn't a fixed state. He thought about his father's voice, which had been the primary voice in his head for 34 years. He thought about what his father would say about today. About Zenith. About what was clearly, undeniably, and with increasing velocity happening between them. He knew exactly what his father would say. For the first time in his life, he let the voice finish and then set it down and left it there. He picked up his phone. He opened a new contact. He typed, "Zenith." He sat with that for a moment. Then he typed a message. "I also remember the thing about the library every Saturday. Your mother had good instincts." He sent it. Her reply came 4 minutes later. She really did. "Good night, Hyunwoo." He looked at his name in her message. She said his name like it was just a word, not a brand, not a title, not a weight. Just a word that meant him. He put his phone down and, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, slept without the lights on. It was Director Shin who found out first. Shin Jae-hyuk had been Hyunwoo's chief operations director for 6 years. A precise, efficient man in his late 40s who had the particular loyalty of someone whose career was entirely constructed on another person's rising tide. He was good at his job. He was also, as Hyunwoo had always known but conveniently set aside, his father's man first. He found out on Thursday. One of the security team, a junior member who understood neither the sensitivity of the information nor the consequences of sharing it casually, had mentioned during a routine briefing that the director had been making unscheduled visits to Mercy General Hospital. Civilian visits. Involving a woman. Shin had the full picture within 48 hours. He requested a private meeting on Friday morning. Hyunwoo was at his desk when Shin came in, reviewing acquisition documents with the focused efficiency that was his natural operating state. He gestured at the chair across the desk without looking up. Shin sat. He had a tablet with him. Hyunwoo noticed this peripherally, and his posture had the quality of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say. "I'll come to it directly," Shin said. "Please. There is a situation that requires your attention." He set the tablet on the desk. "Regarding a personal matter that has the potential to become a professional one." Hyun-woo looked up from his documents. On the tablet screen was a photograph. It had been taken from across the street, the bookshop, last Tuesday, through the cafe window. He and Zenith at the small table, the afternoon light, her hands wrapped around her cup. It was not a dramatic photograph. It was, in fact, a rather quiet one. Two people in conversation, leaning slightly toward each other in the unconscious way of people who have stopped managing the distance between them. He looked at it for a long moment. Something cold moved through him. No shame. Anger. The specific, precise anger of a private person discovering they have been observed. "Who took this?" he said. "The source is secondary." "Who took this, Shin?" A pause. Surveillance. Routine monitoring of the director's movements when in Chicago. Standard security protocol. Whose protocol? Another pause. "Mine, sir." Hyun-woo set his pen down. He set it down with the deliberate, controlled calm of a man who has learned that the quieter he gets, the more effectively the temperature drops in a room. Shin, who had seen this before, who knew the calibration of it, straightened slightly. "You will discontinue that immediately," Hyun-woo said. "And I will deal with the protocol breach separately." "Of course. But the reason I brought this." "I know why you brought it." "Then you understand the concern." Shin leaned forward slightly. "The Chicago board meeting is in 3 weeks. The Seoul investors are already watching this quarter's numbers with heightened attention. The acquisition of Mercer Pacific has drawn scrutiny. And there are members of the board, senior members, whose support you need for the Mercer vote, who are traditional in ways that are directly relevant to," he paused, "to the situation in the photograph." Hyun-woo looked at him. "Say it plainly," he said. Shin held his gaze. "The woman is black. She is a hospital aide. She lives in," he glanced at the tablet, "in a building that your associates would find difficult to reconcile with the image the Choi organization requires its leadership to maintain." A pause. "There are board members who will use this. Who will call into question your judgment. Who will frame this as a pattern, the Whitmore proposal reversal, the Chicago market strategy shift, and now this. They will say you are being compromised. Emotionally. By someone who is." "Careful," Hyun-woo said. Very quietly. Shin stopped. "Whatever the next word was going to be," Hyun-woo said, "you should be very careful." A silence. "I am trying to protect the organization," Shin said. "And you? The way your father would have wanted." "My father is dead," Hyun-woo said. "And his vision of what requires protection died with him. You should update your framework." Shin sat back. He looked at his director for a long moment with the particular expression of a man reassessing how far his authority extends. "The board meeting is in 3 weeks," he said again. "The Mercer vote requires unanimity. You know what's at stake." He stood. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm ensuring you have the full picture." He picked up his tablet. Paused at the door. "Your father built something that has endured because he protected it. I would ask you to consider what protection it requires now." He left. Hyun-woo sat alone in his office. He looked at the empty desk where the tablet had been. He thought about the Mercer acquisition, $800 million, 3 years of preparation, a deal that would expand the Choi organization into Southeast Asian markets that his father had always considered the next frontier. He thought about the board members Shin was referring to. He knew exactly who they were, knew their politics and their prejudices, and knew the specific ways their support was contingent. He thought about his father's voice, which he'd set down last week and which had now, apparently, been picked back up and delivered by proxy. He sat at his desk for a long time. He did something he hadn't done since he was 12 years old, which was to make a decision from fear instead of from clarity. He called her that evening. He'd been going to wait until Tuesday. He'd been looking forward to Tuesday with the particular quiet anticipation of a man who has stopped being ashamed of looking forward to things. He called that evening instead, because Shin's voice was in his head and his father's architecture was reasserting itself, and he told himself he was being practical. "Hey," she said when she answered. Warm. Uncomplicated. "I was just thinking about you." The warmth of that sentence, its ease, its simple honesty, landed in his chest and made what he was about to do harder. He did it anyway. "I need to speak with you," he said. "About where this is going." A pause on her end. Short. She was quick. "Okay. The last few weeks have been," he stopped. Started over with the precision he usually relied on and found tonight was serving the wrong purpose. "There are aspects of my situation that I haven't fully communicated. Professional aspects. Regarding the board and the organization, and the optics of my personal life." Silence. "Optics," she said. "The Mercer acquisition is in 3 weeks. There are board members whose support is contingent on my maintaining a certain." "Stop." Her voice was quiet. "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you telling me that your board members have a problem with who you're spending time with?" A beat. "There are those who would use it against the acquisition." "Use me," she said. "Against your acquisition." He said nothing. "Hyun-woo." Her voice was still quiet, but underneath the quiet was something that had edges. "I need you to say what you're actually saying. Because right now it sounds like you're building to telling me that I am a liability to you. And I need you to be honest enough to say that directly if that's what you mean." He should have said no. He should have said, "That's not what I mean, that's not what this is, give me a moment to say this correctly." He should have said all the true things, that she was not a liability, that Shin was wrong, that his father's framework was not his, and that he had set it down and meant to leave it there. He said, "I think we may need to be more discreet for now, until the vote." The silence that followed was different from any silence that had existed between them before. It had a texture. "Discreet," she said. "It's temporary. 3 weeks and then." "Discreet," she said again. "So I'm someone you need to be discreet about." "That's not." "You came to my neighborhood," she said, and her voice was doing something very controlled that he recognized, with a sinking certainty, as the sound of a person absorbing a blow and deciding how to carry it. "You came to Chang's and you apologized, and you came back and you remembered about the library and the Saturdays, and you sat in a break room and talked about your sister, and you took me to a bookshop and you said," she stopped. "You said you remember everything I say." "I do." "But what you actually remember," she said quietly, "is that I'm someone you need to be discreet about. That's what you remember when the pressure gets real." Zenith. "Did someone say something to you? Someone in your organization?" He was quiet for 1 second too long. She heard it. "Right," she said. "It's not." "I have been here before," she said, and the quiet in her voice had changed, had become the specific quiet of someone who is not going to cry, who has decided firmly and completely not to cry, and is using every resource they have to hold that line. "Not with you. But I have been the person that someone needed to be careful about. That someone needed to manage and contain and make smaller so it didn't complicate their larger life." She paused. I told you specifically, I don't do that. I will not be managed. I'm not trying to manage you." "You called me to tell me to be discreet," she said. "That is management, Hyun-woo. That is you deciding how much of me is acceptable in your world and asking me to help you enforce that limit." Her voice was very steady. "I won't do it. I'm not angry, a breath. I won't do it." 3 weeks, he said. "That's all I'm asking." "You're asking me to make myself smaller so your board is comfortable," she said. That's not a timeline. That's a statement about what you think I'm worth. A pause. And I know what I'm worth. It took me a long time to know it, but I know it. Zenith. Good night, Hyunwoo. She hung up. She sat on her bed in the dark. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself she wouldn't, and she was a woman who kept her promises to herself, especially the hard ones. She sat in the dark and breathed and let the feeling be what it was, sharp and specific and unfortunately very familiar. The particular pain of being asked to be less so that someone else could be more comfortable. She'd thought he was different. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. She'd thought, and this was the part that cost her, this was the part that she'd have to examine carefully later when she had more distance. She'd thought that what she saw in the break room doorway, when he stood there with his face open and his walls down, was the real thing. She'd thought the bookshop was the real thing. She'd thought the careful way he listened was the real thing. Maybe it was. Maybe all of it was real and just not enough. Not everyone who sees the door chooses to walk through it. She lay down on her bed without taking her shoes off. She looked at the ceiling. On the windowsill, her plant stood small and dark against the window, its leaves catching the streetlight. Her mother's voice, unbidden, with the clarity that only came when she stopped trying to manage things. Everybody deserves to have someone in their corner, baby. Even at the end. Especially at the end. Zenith closed her eyes. What about me, Mama? She thought. Who's in mine? She didn't sleep for a long time. Hyunwoo didn't sleep at all. He sat in his hotel room, $900 a night, views he never looked at, and looked at his phone. Her name is on the screen. The last message she'd sent him, 3 days ago, she really did. Good night, Hyunwoo. He thought about what he'd said. He thought about what he'd meant and what he'd said and the gap between those two things. A gap that had opened without warning and swallowed everything he'd been building for weeks. He thought about Shin's voice. His father's voice through Shin's mouth. The photograph on the tablet. 2 people at a cafe table, leaning toward each other in the way of people who have stopped managing the distance. He thought about what Zenith had said. You're asking me to make myself smaller so your board is comfortable. He sat with that sentence. He turned it over. Examined it. Applied his characteristic precision to the question of whether it was true. It was true. He had sat in a hotel room and listened to a man deliver his dead father's voice through a tablet screen, and he had taken the architecture his father built when he was 19 years old and applied it to the one person who had, in the space of a few weeks, done more to dismantle it than 34 years of living in it had. He thought about Sujin, who had no bones and didn't pretend to be harder than she was. He thought about a girl who spent her last $11 on a stranger's soup. He thought about a break room table and 2 women holding hands and a name said aloud for the first time in 22 years. He thought about a bookshop and 4 hours and a laugh that arrived without warning. He thought about what his father had built and what it had cost and what he, Hyunwoo, had continued paying long after the bill was settled. He sat in the dark for a very long time. Then he picked up his phone. Not to call Zenith. Not yet, not tonight. She'd said good night and meant it, and he owed her the dignity of respecting that. He called Shin. It was 1 a.m. Shin answered on the second ring, because men like Shin always answered, always available for the access they'd traded their autonomy for. The photograph, Hyunwoo said first. And any other surveillance material related to her. Delete it. All of it. Every copy, every file, every backup. Tonight. I want confirmation by morning. A pause. Sir. Tonight, Shin. A shorter pause. Understood. The Whitmore proposal, Hyunwoo continued. Put it at the top of Monday's agenda. Full review, with a recommendation to proceed. A pause. Sir. And the board members you referenced. The traditional ones. Schedule individual meetings with each of them next week. I'll have those conversations personally. What kind of conversations? The kind where I tell them, Hyun-woo said, what the Choi organization's values are going to look like going forward. And give them the opportunity to decide if they can work within that. Silence. You're risking the Mercer vote, Shin said. I'm aware. Your father. Good night, Shin, Hyun-woo said. He ended the call. He sat in the dark. He'd just made a decision that could cost him $800 million and a decade of preparation and the vote of half his board. He felt, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, completely clear. But clarity, he understood, was not the same as repair. He'd said what he'd said to Zenith. She'd heard what she'd heard, because it was what he'd said, and she was a woman who listened accurately and didn't revise what she'd received for her own comfort. He had a call to make that was not 1 a.m. material. It required daylight and the right words and, more than anything he'd needed in a very long time, the courage to say the true thing without the armor. He was 34 years old and he had sat on the lid of the box for 22 years. He put his phone down. He looked at the city through the window, the grid of lights, amber and white and cold blue, and thought about old buildings and what made things last. And he understood finally, sitting there alone with the cost of his own choices, what the answer to that question actually was. Not the materials. Not the foundation. The willingness of someone to keep choosing to stay in it. I want to ask you something before we get to the ending. And I mean this genuinely. Have you ever watched someone choose fear over love and had to decide whether to wait for them to find their courage? What did you do? Drop it in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this, because what comes next for these two depends entirely on whether you believe people can choose differently when they finally understand the cost. Tell me what you think. He called his mother at 7 a.m. Not because he'd planned to, he'd planned in the measured way he planned most things, to sit with the previous night's decisions until they settled into certainty before speaking to anyone. But he woke at 6:47 after 3 hours of fractured sleep, lay in the gray morning light of his hotel room, and found that the thing he most needed was the one voice that had never, not once in 34 years, told him what he wanted to hear in place of what he needed to. She answered immediately. You didn't sleep, she said. Good morning, Iyama. I can tell by how you breathe. You've been holding your breath since yesterday. A pause. What happened? He told her. All of it, Shin's visit, the photograph, the board members, what he'd said to Zenith, and what she'd said back. He told it plainly and without editorializing, the way he told his mother things when he'd decided to actually tell her rather than manage what she received. When he finished there was a silence on her end that had weight and temperature and a specific quality he'd learned to read over 34 years. It was the silence of his mother deciding something. Come to breakfast, she said. I have calls at 8, move them. He moved them. She was staying at a smaller hotel than his. She always refused to stay in the properties he offered her, which was one of many ways she maintained her independence from the empire that bore her name. It was a quiet place on the north side with a breakfast room that had actual tablecloths and a window overlooking a small courtyard where December had left a thin layer of snow on a stone bench. She was already at the table when he arrived. Tea in front of her, hands folded, wearing a soft gray sweater that made her look briefly like someone's grandmother rather than the formidable woman who had survived Choi Byung-go and raised 2 children in the seismic pressure of that particular life. He sat across from her. A server brought coffee without being asked. His mother had clearly arranged this. She was thoughtful about the small mechanics of situations. She looked at him. He looked at her. Before you say anything, he said. I'm not going to say the thing you're expecting me to say, she said. What am I expecting? That you were wrong. That you hurt her. That you should apologize. She poured her tea with the precise economy of motion she brought to everything. You already know all of that. You called me at 7 in the morning, which means you haven't slept, which means you spent the night knowing it. She set the pot down. I'm not going to tell you what you already know. He looked at his coffee. Then what are you going to tell me? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on the snow-covered stone bench in the courtyard and regarded the winter with visible disapproval. I'm going to tell you about your father, she said. He looked up. When I met Byungo, she began, he was 26. He had nothing. Nothing his father had given him anyway, which was the point. He had built the beginning of something from pure will and intelligence and a ferocity that was extraordinary to witness. She paused. He was also the most frightened person I had ever met. Hyunwoo said nothing. He was listening in the way he'd learned to listen from her. Completely, without preparing his response. He was frightened of failing, she continued. Of being seen as insufficient. Of the world discovering that the confidence was constructed. That underneath the architecture was a boy from a poor family in Busan who had been told, specifically and repeatedly, that people like him did not build things that lasted. She looked at her tea. So he built walls. He called them standards. He called them values and discipline, and the necessary requirements of a serious man in a serious world. A pause. They were walls. I knew they were walls. I married him anyway because I was 23 and I believed, as young people do, that love was enough to change the shape of someone. Was it? Hyunwoo asked. No, she said simply. Love is not enough to change the shape of someone. The person has to want to change. Love can be the reason, but the person has to do the work. She looked at her son. Your father never did the work. He got very good at the wall. He taught you to build one too, because he believed, genuinely believed, that it was what kept him safe. That it was the source of his strength. Her voice was steady and sad in equal measure. He was wrong. The wall was the source of his survival, which is not the same thing as strength. Strength is what you have when the wall comes down and you're still standing. Hyunwoo looked at the courtyard. The pigeon was gone. The snow on the bench was undisturbed and white and clean. After Soo-jin, he said. Yes, his mother said. After Soo-jin. A silence. He never spoke about her, Hyunwoo said. After the first month. Not once. I used to, he stopped. I used to say her name sometimes, deliberately, to see if he would react. To see if something was still there. A pause. He would just continue. Whatever he was doing. I know, his mother said quietly. I watched you do that. I should have, she stopped. Her hands tightened slightly around her cup. I should have spoken. I should have told you that his silence was not the correct response to grief. That you needed to say her name was not a weakness. That the fact that you carried her, that you still carry her, I can see it in you every day, is not a liability. Her voice, for the first time, showed the fault line beneath the composure. I was grieving too. And I was not brave enough to grieve differently from your father in front of you. And I am sorry for that, Hyunwoo. I am sorry for that every day. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. The same gesture, the same instinct, passed back and forth between them like something they'd been tending together without knowing. Iyama, he said. Let me finish, she said. He left his hand where it was. What Zenith did that night, she continued, when she found me, she didn't do it because she calculated a benefit. She didn't do it because she wanted something in return. She did it because she was raised by a woman who believed that people deserve someone in their corner. And she has lived that belief every day despite every reason the world has given her not to. She looked at her son with eyes that were very bright and very clear. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She is what you raised me to be, he said. And didn't manage to be. What I tried to raise you to be, she corrected gently. Before your father's architecture got there first. A pause. But Hyunwoo, you are not your father. You have never been entirely your father. I have watched you fight that architecture your whole life, even when you didn't know you were fighting it. The Whitmore reversal. The way you listened to that girl in the break room, really listened, I watched you. The way you drove yourself to her neighborhood in a regular car with no driver because you wanted her to see you without the apparatus. She squeezed his hand. That is not your father. That is you. Choosing differently. He looked at their hands on the table. I hurt her, he said. Yes. She told me specifically. That she won't be managed. That she knows what she's worth. He paused. And then I managed her anyway, the first time real pressure was applied. Yes, his mother said again, without softening it. She won't, he stopped. She doesn't need me. She's been very clear about that. She's been managing without me for a long time and she'll continue to manage without me and I have nothing she needs. I don't know what I have to offer her that she can't provide for herself. Mrs. Choi looked at her son for a long moment. You are asking the wrong question, she said. What's the right one? Not what you have to offer. Not what she needs. She held his eyes. What do you need, Hyunwoo? Not the organization. Not the board. Not your father's legacy or Shin's approval or the Mercer acquisition. Her voice was very gentle. You. What do you need? He looked at her. The breakfast room was quiet around them, the soft clink of a cup somewhere behind him, the low conversation of other tables, the winter light coming gray and clean through the courtyard window. He thought about Tuesday. About the bookshop. About 4 hours had passed like 20 minutes because he'd been entirely present in a way he almost never was. Not managing, not calculating, not working backward from a desired outcome. Just there. Just with her. He thought about what she'd said in the car. Deserving isn't a fixed state. It's something you're in the process of. He thought about being 12 years old and sitting by a hospital window and not understanding why the world had continued past a particular Tuesday afternoon in October, and his father putting a hand on his shoulder and saying, "We move forward. That's what we do." And him moving forward. For 22 years. Without stopping to understand what he was moving away from. I need to stop moving forward, he said. His mother tilted her head. I need to, he looked for the right words and found them slowly, in the place beneath the usual architecture. I need to stop treating grief like a debt to be settled. And love is like a risk to be managed. And people like variables in an equation I'm trying to control. He looked at his mother. I've been running a company like my life and my life like a company, and somewhere in that I have become, a pause. Very efficient. And very alone. Mrs. Choi's eyes were very bright. Yes, she said softly. She's not a risk, he said. The words arrive with the clarity that comes only after a long time in the dark. She's the opposite of a risk. She's the only person I have met in, longer than I can calculate, who has made me feel like the wall is not load-bearing. Like I could take it down and the structure would still stand. Then take it down, his mother said simply. She may not, he stopped. After what I said. She may not. She is not a woman who makes permanent decisions from temporary pain, Mrs. Choi said. I know her. She is hurt. She is not closed. A pause. But Hyunwoo, she will need the real thing. Not the managed version. Not the discreet version. The whole truth said out loud, with nothing held back for safety. She looked at him steadily. Can you do that? He sat with the question. Not the reflexive yes that his professional life had trained him to deploy, The yes that meant I will find a way to execute this efficiently. The real question: can you stand in front of someone who has told you exactly who she is and offer her exactly who you are, with no apparatus, no backup, no safety net and no guarantee? He thought about old buildings. He thought about what made things last. Not the materials. The willingness of someone to keep choosing to stay in it. I don't know, he said honestly. Mrs. Choi smiled. A full smile, the real one, the one that transformed her face the way her son's face transformed on the very rare occasions it allowed itself to. That, she said, is the most honest answer you have ever given me. She picked up her tea. Go find out, she said. He sat in the courtyard afterward. He'd asked the server for more coffee and taken it outside, which the server had clearly found eccentric given the December temperature, but had accommodated without comment because Hyunwoo had the kind of presence that made people accommodate things without comment. He sat on the snow-dusted bench, the one the pigeon had disapproved of, in his coat with his coffee and the cold, and he sat with himself in a way he hadn't in a very long time. Not reviewing. Not strategizing. Just sitting. He thought about Sujin's theory of octopuses, the most honest animals, no bones, no pretending to be harder than they were. He'd been pretending to be harder than he was for 22 years. He thought about what it would mean to stop. Not as a strategy. Not as a step in a plan to win back the person he'd hurt. Just as a way of living. A different way of moving through the world. One where the feelings were not liabilities to be managed but information to be followed. Where grief was not a weakness but a form of love with nowhere left to go. Where a woman who spent her last $11 on a stranger's soup was not a risk to his reputation but the most clarifying thing that had ever happened to him. He took out his phone. He didn't call her. It wasn't a phone call. He understood that. What he had to say required him to be present. Required her to be able to see his face, which had spent 34 years hiding things and had recently, in hospital corridors and bookshops and break rooms, been learning to stop. He texted instead. One line. I need to see you. Not to explain. To say what I should have said. Whenever you're willing. He sent it. He sat in the cold with his coffee and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. He thought, she doesn't have to respond. She doesn't owe him a response. She is a woman who knows what she's worth and he has, very recently and specifically, demonstrated that he was capable of forgetting it. She would be entirely within her rights to leave his message on read and direct her considerable strength toward the many other things and people in her life who deserved it. 15 minutes. He thought about what his mother had said, she is not a woman who makes permanent decisions from temporary pain. He thought, but maybe this was not temporary pain. Maybe he'd confirmed something she'd always suspected was coming, the limit of how far someone like him was willing to go for someone like her. Maybe he'd proven the thing she'd been waiting to be proven. He thought, if she doesn't respond, you have to accept that. You have to let that be the consequence of what you chose. He thought, that would be the right thing. He thought, it would cost everything. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. I work until 9 tonight. Z. He read it 3 times. It was not a yes. It was not a forgiveness. It was not an invitation with the door wide open. It was a single factual statement, the kind a woman makes when she hasn't decided yet but hasn't decided against yet either. The kind that means, I'm leaving a window. What you do with it is on you. He looked at the time. It was 9:15 a.m. He had 11 hours and 45 minutes to be ready to say the true thing with nothing held back for safety. He stood up from the snow-dusted bench. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the courtyard. Small, quiet, the winter light coming through clean and gray and honest. He went back inside. He had work to do, not the organizational kind. The other kind. The kind his father had never taught him and he was going to have to figure out in real time, without a framework, without a strategy, with nothing but the increasingly clear understanding that he had spent 34 years being very good at survival and had very recently encountered something worth living for instead. He called his head of security. "I need the evening clear," he said. "Everything." "Sir, you have a dinner with the..." "Clear it." "And the car." "I'll drive myself." A pause. "Sir, is everything..." "Everything is fine," Hyun-woo said. And meant, for perhaps the first time he'd ever said it, something close to the truth. He spent the day differently than he'd ever spent a workday. He took the board calls he needed to take, the ones with the traditional members Shin had referenced, and he had the conversations he'd told Shin he would have. Directly. Without diplomatic cushioning. He told 3 men, in sequence, that the Choi organization's direction was evolving. That his leadership would reflect values that were not contingent on the cultural preferences of any subset of the board. That the Mercer vote would stand on its merits. That those who could not work within an organization committed to those values would be respectfully, but completely, given the opportunity to exit. 2 of them pushed back. He held. One of them, after a long silence, said something that surprised him. "I respect that. Your father never talked like that. I always thought he should have." He sat with that for a moment after the call. Then he did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He called his father's old accountant, a man named Mr. O, who had been with the organization since the beginning and who knew better than anyone the full history of what had been built and how. "Mr. O," he said, "I want to understand something. The original company, before my father's, before the full structure was in place. What was it built on? What did he actually believe in, at the beginning? Before everything else?" Mr. O was quiet for a moment. He believed, the old man said slowly, that the people who built things deserved to benefit from what they built. That was the original idea. It was quite simple. He used to say, the person who lays the foundation should own a piece of the house. A pause. He got complicated later. But that was the beginning. Hyun-woo sat with that. The person who lays the foundation should own a piece of the house. He thought about a woman who had laid a foundation. In him, in his mother, in a break room and a bookshop and a noodle shop on Mallard Street, without asking for anything in return. He put down the phone and looked at the city for a while. Then he got ready. She knew he would come. She didn't let herself think about it during her shift. She was too good at her job and too respectful of her patients to bring her personal woes into their rooms. She moved through the ward with her full attention, checked vitals, changed IVs, sat for 6 minutes with a woman named Mrs. Patterson who was having a hard night and needed a hand to hold and someone to tell her that the fear was allowed, that being afraid didn't mean being alone. The fear is allowed, Zenith told her. You don't have to be brave all the time. She said it to Mrs. Patterson. She heard it for herself. She thought about his text exactly 3 times during the shift. Not to analyze it, just to feel the shape of it. Not to explain. To say what I should have said. She knew the difference between a man explaining himself and a man telling the truth. She'd encountered enough of both to know the difference in the texture, the way you know the difference between synthetic warmth and the real thing. She didn't know yet which this was. She was going to find out at 9 p.m. She clocked out at 9:03. She took her time, changed out of her uniform in the break room, retied her braids, put on her brown boots and her burgundy sweater, which she told herself she was wearing because it was warm and not for any other reason, and which she didn't entirely believe. Brianna was waiting in the corridor. He texted you, Brianna said. Not a question. I told you that this morning. I know. I'm just. Brianna looked at her. You okay? Zenith looked back at her. Ask me in an hour, she said. Brianna nodded. Then she pulled Zenith into a brief, fierce hug, the kind that doesn't need words because all the words are already understood, and let her go. Zenith walked toward the elevator. He was outside. Not in the car. Not by the SUV. He was standing on the pavement in front of the hospital's main entrance in his coat with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in the December cold, and he was just standing there. No apparatus. No driver. No performance. Just him. She pushed through the glass doors and stopped. He turned at the sound. They looked at each other across 15 feet of cold pavement and December air, and she saw immediately, with the clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years reading people at the edge of things, that something was different. Not the lake in winter face. Not the composed, sealed, sorted expression. Something more open than she'd seen from him even in the best moments of the last few weeks. Something that looked, plainly and without decoration, like a man who had put something down and come here without it. She walked toward him. Stopped a few feet away. "You came," she said. "I said I would. You said you needed to see me. That's not exactly the same as saying you'd come." "I know." He held her eyes. "I came." She looked at him for a moment. "It's cold. There's a bench around the side by the garden. It's sheltered." She led the way. He followed. The hospital had a small winter garden on its south side. Mostly dormant now, the beds covered, a stone path between bare-limbed trees, a wooden bench under a small overhang that kept the worst of the wind off. Someone had strung small lights in the branches overhead. White minimal, the kind that look like stars if you're in the right frame of mind. They sat. Not close, a careful distance, the kind that acknowledges that the last conversation between them had moved things, that the previous ease needed to be re-earned. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and looked at the garden for a moment. She sat with her hands in her coat pockets and waited. She was very good at waiting. She did not fill silences for other people's comfort. "I had a conversation with my mother this morning," he began. "I figured. She told me about my father. Things I knew in part and hadn't assembled into a complete picture." He paused. He was afraid his whole life. He built an empire on the architecture of his fear and called it strength, and he taught me to build the same, and I did. He looked at his hands. "I have been, for a very long time, mistaking survival for living, and control for safety, and dismissal for discernment." Zenith said nothing. She was listening, the full, unhurried kind. "What I said to you on the phone," he said. "The word discreet." He stopped. "I want to be precise about what happened there, because I think you deserve precision." He looked up at her. "A man who works for me showed me a photograph of us in the bookshop. He told me that board members would use you, to question my judgment. He invoked my father. And a pause. I let 22 years of architecture make a decision in the space of 30 seconds. And I called you and said the wrong thing with the wrong word and made you feel like a liability," she said quietly. "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "Like a liability. Which you are not. Which you have never been. Which is so far from what you are to me that the distance between those two things is, I don't have a unit of measurement for it." She looked at him. "What did you do?" she said. "After the call. What did you actually do?" He told her. The 1 a.m. call to Shin. The 3 board member conversations. The Whitmore proposal. The clarity about the Mercer vote and the values of the organization going forward. She listened. "You risked the acquisition," she said. "Yes." "That's Hyunwoo. That's $800 million. I know what it is." "You did that." "I did that." A pause. "I want to be clear about something. I didn't do it as a gesture. Not to to win an argument or prove a point or make myself look like someone you should forgive. I did it because it was correct. Because I looked at what I'd built the decision on and recognized that it was my father's foundation, not mine, and I don't want to live in my father's house anymore. He held her eyes. The fact that it might mean something to you that matters to me. But that wasn't the reason. She studied him. Why are you telling me it wasn't the reason? She asked. Because you told me you don't do well with management. With people who calculate what to show you. And telling you I moved heaven and earth for you specifically it would be calculated. It would be giving you information designed to produce a response. He looked at her steadily. I don't want to produce a response from you, Zenith. I want to tell you the truth and let you do whatever you want with it. Silence. The white lights in the branches above them were very still. Okay, she said. Then tell me the truth. All of it. She turned to face him more fully. Not the organizational truth. The personal one. What you actually came here to say. He looked at her. And then, in the specific way of a man who has spent the day dismantling a wall and has arrived at the place where the last stones are, and has to decide whether to finish, he finished. I have been alone in a way that I normalized so thoroughly I stopped being able to see it, he said. I have run a company and traveled the world and sat across tables from more people than I can count, and I have been, essentially completely alone. And I had decided, somewhere around the age of 12, that this was simply my nature. That I was the kind of person who functioned best at a remove. He paused. And then a woman spent her last $11 on my mother's dinner and refused to be reimbursed and walked away without looking back, and something happened that I have been unable to file or resolve or manage. She was very still. I think about you, he said. Consistently. In the spaces between everything else. In the way that I don't think about things I don't want to lose. He held her eyes without flinching. I don't want to lose this. Whatever this is. Whatever it could become if I stop destroying it with my own hands. A pause. I don't have a framework for this. I don't know the correct pace or the correct method. I know how to build organizations. I don't know how to. I am learning how to be a person who chooses things from want instead of from fear. He looked at her. But I want to learn it. I want to learn it with you. The winter garden was very quiet around them. Somewhere above the overhang, a wind moved through the bare branches of the trees and made a sound that was almost like breathing. Zenith looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she looked at patience. Not the chart, the person. And what she saw was a man with no wall and no armor and nothing held back for safety, sitting on a cold bench in December, having said the true thing out loud with full knowledge that she might not reach back. She thought about her mother. Everybody deserves to have someone in their corner, baby. Even at the end. Especially at the end. She thought about what Hyunwoo had said in the break room, the thing that had undone her more than she'd admitted. She's still in your corner. What she gave you, she's still doing it. Through you. She thought about the $11. She thought about the torn left pocket of her puffer jacket and the plant on her windowsill and the eviction notice she'd navigated herself through and the prescription she stretched and the extra shift she picked up and the particular, specific dignity of being a woman who managed her own life with precision and grace and never once asked for rescue. She thought about the difference between rescue and choosing. She thought about what it meant to choose. Hyunwoo, she said. Yes. I need you to understand something. Her voice was even and warm and completely clear. I don't need you. I want you to know that going in, I am not a woman who can be sustained by someone else's wealth or protected by someone else's power. I will pay my own rent and work my own shifts and make my own way because that is who I am, and any version of this where you decide that you can smooth out my life with your resources without being asked is a version that won't last 2 weeks. She held his eyes. I'm not a project. I'm not a cause. I'm not a person you get credit for choosing. I know, he said. Do you? You are the most complete person I have ever encountered, he said. You are not in need of completion. You are, he paused, finding the words carefully. You are someone I want to stand next to. Not in front of, not behind, not above. He looked at her steadily. Next to. She looked at him. And the people in your world, she said. The board members. The ones who looked at that photograph and saw a problem. That doesn't go away because you had some hard conversations. No, he said. It doesn't. There will be more conversations. There will be, he paused. There will be people who never recalibrate. Who will look at us and see what their limitations allow them to see. He held her eyes. I cannot promise you a world without that. I can promise you that I will never again be the one asking you to make yourself smaller because of it. She felt that land. Let it settle. That's a big promise, she said. I don't make small ones, he said. I've learned they're not worth the words. The lights in the branches above them flickered once in a cold gust, then steadied. She looked at the lights for a moment. She thought about all of it, the whole shape of the last several weeks. The bus stop and the noodle shop and the fluorescent break room and the bookshop and 4 hours that felt like 20 minutes and a phone call that had cost them both something real. She thought about what was on the other side of fear and what you had to be willing to lose to find out. She thought about deserving. Not a fixed state. Something you're in the process of. She turned back to him. The first time you do it again, she said. The first time you reach for the wall instead of reaching for me, I need you to catch it. I need you to catch it and say so. I don't need perfection. I need honesty. Yes, he said immediately. And your mother, she said, and something warmed in her voice. Your mother is non-negotiable. She's part of this. Something moved across his face. The shadow of a smile that arrived and stayed this time, didn't just pass through. She will be insufferably pleased to hear that, he said. She already knows, Zenith said. She knew before either of us did. She knew before I was born, probably, he said. She's been setting this up since the bus stop. She absolutely has, Zenith agreed. They looked at each other. And then she did something she hadn't planned. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. Not dramatically, not with an announcement. Just, put her hand over his, the way you place something down carefully in a spot you've chosen. He looked at their hands. He turned his over, slowly, and held hers. His hand was warm despite the cold. She noticed that. Of course she noticed that. She was a woman who paid attention to the things that mattered. Next Tuesday, she said, into the quiet. He looked up. There's a building, she said. On the south side. 1920s, still standing, incredible detail on the facade. I walk past it on my way to the transit stop and I've always wanted to know the story of it. She tilted her head slightly. Someone told me he looks at old buildings and thinks about what makes things last. He was very still. I would like to know what he thinks, she said. About that one. He looked at her for a long moment, with the open, undefended look, the one that had first appeared in a break room doorway and that she'd been quietly watching him practice ever since. Next Tuesday, he said. Next Tuesday, she said. She didn't move her hand. He didn't let it go. Above them, the white lights in the bare branches burned steady and small against the December dark. The kind that look like stars if you're in the right frame of mind. They were, both of them, in the right frame of mind. 3 weeks later, the Mercer acquisition passed. Unanimously. The 2 board members who'd pushed back had, in the end, reviewed the numbers and reviewed their options and made the practical decision. Which was, in Heinwa's experience, usually how practical men arrived at the right place, even if for the wrong reasons. The Whitmore partnership was formalized the same week. Before Shin's transfer was finalized, Hyunwoo called him into the office one last time. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. You took a photograph of a private citizen, he said. Without her knowledge. Without her consent. And you brought it to me as a tool. He let that sit for a moment. She is not a tool. She is not a liability, a variable, or a complication. She is a person, and what you did reduced her to an instrument in someone else's story without her permission. He held Shin's eyes. I want you to understand that clearly before you go. Not as a reprimand. As a fact I need you to carry. Shin was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not quite remorse, but its first cousin. I was protecting the organization, he said. You were protecting a version of the organization that no longer exists, Hyunwoo said. Safe travels, Shin. He approved the transfer without ceremony and without malice, because he was learning, was genuinely, actively in the process of learning, that not every ending required a verdict. But some endings required a truth. And he'd given Shin one. Mrs. Choi went back to Seoul in January. She came to say goodbye at the hospital, her last Wednesday visit, though she informed both Zenith and Brianna that she would return in spring, and that she expected to be fed, and that she had already identified 3 more restaurants in the neighborhood that required investigation. She hugged Brianna, which Brianna received with visible emotion and immediately blamed on the dry winter air. She held Zenith's hands in both of hers and looked at her for a long moment. My daughter, she said, would have loved you. Zenith's throat tightened. I think I would have loved her too, she said. Mrs. Choi squeezed her hands once, the full, certain grip of a woman who has given something precious into the right keeping. Take care of him, she said. We're going to take care of each other, Zenith said gently. Mrs. Choi's eyes went bright. Yes, she said. That is what I meant. After she left, Zenith stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about the smaller hotel on the north side. About a woman who bore the name of a $4.2 billion empire and chose deliberately, every time, to stay somewhere it wasn't written on the walls. Who maintained the distinction between who she was and what surrounded her with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. Zenith thought, I understand that. She thought, maybe that's why she recognized it in me. She went back to work. The building on the south side was a 1924 commercial block, original terracotta detailing, arched windows on the 3rd floor, a cornice that had survived a century of Chicago winters without apology. They stood in front of it on a Tuesday afternoon in January, their breath making small clouds in the cold, his hand warm around hers. What makes it last? She asked. He looked at it for a long moment, with the quality of attention he brought to things he considered worth answering honestly. The people who kept choosing it, he said. Every decade, someone decided it was worth preserving. Worth the cost. He paused, looking at the terracotta detailing along the upper frieze, the small decorative flourishes that a craftsman had spent hours on in 1924 for a building he would never own. This one almost came down in 1987. The city had it marked for demolition, the neighborhood had declined, and the economics didn't make sense. And a woman who ran a seamstress shop on the ground floor organized the block. Wrote letters for 2 years. Wouldn't stop. He glanced at Zenith. The city relented. The building was landmarked. The seamstress shop closed in 1993, but the building is still standing. He looked at her. It didn't last because it was built perfectly. It lasted because someone who had no official power and nothing to gain decided it was worth fighting for. He held her eyes. And wouldn't stop. She looked at the building for a long moment. I like her, she said. I thought you would, he said. She leaned into him slightly. He adjusted, natural, immediate, and the unconscious recalibration she'd noticed from the beginning, and that she understood now was simply how he was around her. Present. Attentive. There. Hyunwoo, she said. Yes. I'm glad I stopped. He looked at her. At the bus stop, she said. I'm glad I stopped walking. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the voice that told you to keep walking. The practical one, she said. Yes. What made you stop anyway? She thought about it honestly, the way she did most things. Her hands were trembling, she said. She was working so hard to keep them still. All that dignity in the middle of all that difficulty. She paused. I recognized it. He held her hand a little more firmly. I'm glad too, he said quietly. I don't have adequate language for how glad. She smiled. You're getting better at language, she said. I have a good teacher, he said. She looked up at him, the open face, the one that was becoming his default now, the one that had replaced the lake in winter with something warmer and less sealed. The face of a man who had taken the wall down stone by stone and was discovering, with increasing and genuine surprise, that the structure was still standing. That he was still standing. She reached up and put her palm briefly against his cheek, warm, certain, deliberate. He closed his eyes for a moment. In the dark behind his eyes, for just a moment, he thought of Sujin. Not with the old grief, the sealed, pressurized kind he'd carried for 22 years like something that might detonate if handled. With something lighter. Something that felt, strangely and completely, like she was nearby. Like she had arranged her small hands on her hips and was looking at Zenith with the assessing, immediately certain look she'd always had about people she'd already decided to love. She would have found her very quickly. He opened his eyes. Zenith was looking at him with that expression. The one that saw everything, that didn't look away, that had no performance in it at all. Okay. She said softly. Yes, he said. And meant it in every register the word contained. Then he opened them and looked at her, and the January light was on both of them, and the 1924 building stood behind them, having survived 100 winters through the simple, extraordinary fact of people deciding, decade by decade, that it was worth it. They turned and walked. Not toward anything dramatic. Just forward together, into the ordinary extraordinary fact of a Tuesday. A cold, clear, unremarkable Tuesday that had become, without ceremony or announcement, exactly enough. And here, at the very end, is the question I've been sitting with this whole time, and I want you to answer it in the comments before you go. What is the bravest thing you've ever done for love? Not the grand gesture, the small one. The stopping when every practical voice said keep walking. The hand you held. The truth you said out loud when it would have been so much easier to say nothing. Tell me. Because that is what this story has always really been about. Not the billionaire, not the empire, not the $11. The decision to stop. To see. To stay. Drop it below. I read every single one. Kindly subscribe and stay tuned for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.